Chapter 28 of The Moon Rock by Arthur J. Rees. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Moon Rock, Chapter 28. It was a strange story which Charles Turold heard by that grey Cornish sea, a story touched with the glitter of adventurous fortune in the sombre setting of a trachytic island, where wine-dark breakers beat monotonously on the black beach of volcanic sand, strewn with driftwood, kelp, dead shells, and the squirming forms of blindworms tossed up from the bowels of a dead sea. It was there in the spell of solitude 30 years before that Robert Turold's soul had yielded to temptation at the beck of his monstrous ambition. That, however, was the end, or what Robert Turold imagined to be the end of the story. The listener was first invited to contemplate a scene in human progress when men gathered from the four corners of the earth and underwent incredible hardships of hunger, thirst, disease, lived like beasts and died like vermin for the sake of precious stones in the earth. Thalassa brought up before the young man's eyes a vivid picture of an African diamond rush of that period, a corrugated iron settlement of one straggling street, knee-deep in sand, swarming with vermin and scorpions, almost waterless, crowded with a mongrel, ever-increasing lot of needy adventurers brought from all parts of the world by reports of diamond which could be picked out with a penknife from the dunes and sandy shingle which formed the background of the villainous town. In the great waves and ridges of sand which stretched everywhere as far as the eye could reach, runaway scoundrels of every shade of color wormed on their bellies with the terrible pertinacity of ants, sweating and groping in that choking dust for the glittering crystals so rarely found. Thalassa had been infected by the diamond fever like so many more. Like other young men, he wanted plenty of money for women and grog, and what else, he asked, could a man get for money that was worth having? In those days he was a sailor before the mast, lacking the capital for such delights. So he deserted his timber tramp when she touched at Port Elizabeth and set out for the diamond fields with another runaway, the ship's cook, who had an ambition to have his meals cooked for him for the rest of his life instead of cooking meals for other people. The fields were far to the north. Thalassa reached them after a terrible journey through the stony veldt and sandy desert broken by barren hills. His companion died of the hardships and was buried in the desert which stretched to the wandering course of the Orange River. Thalassa secured his license and went prospecting. "Does he know anything about diamonds? Digging for them?" he broke off to ask. Charles Turold shook his head. Thalassa lapsed into silence for some moments, his eyes fixed on the sea hissing among the black, wet rocks at his feet, and then said, "A man is a fool most of his days, but sometimes he can be such a fool that the memory will come back to mock him when he lays dying. Here was I deserting my ship and throwing away a year's wages and almost my life to get to these damned fields, thinking to pick up diamonds cut and glittering like I had seen them in London shops, when as soon as I had clapped eyes on the first diamond I saw dug up, I knew that I had left behind me at the other end of the world as many rough diamonds as there was in the whole of the dustbin of a place, diamonds that didn't have to be dug for either, only I didn't know them when I saw them." His narrowed eye gleamed craftily, a mere pinpoint of expression in the direction of Charles, as though expecting a question. But Charles kept silence, so he went on with his story. He let it to be understood that his luck on the fields was of the worst possible description. Never a solitary stone came his way. But he had no heart for digging. He was always thinking of the diamond in the remote spot which he had ignorantly let slip from his grasp, like the dog in the fable dropping the substance for the shadow. He would have gone back to look for them, but he had spent most of his little capital in that wild-goose chase, and the miserable remnant oozed away like water in a place where the barest necessities of life cost fabulous prices. Soon he became stranded, practically penniless. It was his precarious moment of his fortunes which his star, his evil star, he insisted on that, selected to bring him into juxtaposition with a man whose life was to be inexorably mingled with his own from that time henceforward. The actual meeting place was a tin-roofed grog shanty kept by a giant Kaffir woman and a sore-eyed degenerate white man whose subjection to his black paramour had earned for him among the blacks on the field the terrible sobriquet of White Harry. Here one night Thalassa sat drinking bad beer and planning impossible schemes for returning to his diamonds at the other end of the world. The place was empty of other customers. The Kaffir woman slumbered behind the flimsy planking of the bar, and White Harry sat on the counter scraping tunes out of a little fiddle. Thalassa remembered the tune he was playing, Annie Laurie. Upon this scene there entered two young men, Englishmen. Thalassa discerned that at once by the cut of their chip. Besides, they ordered base beer. Who else but Englishmen would order base beer at 5 shillings a bottle in a godforsaken place like that? He was one of them. Thalassa moved his hand vaguely in the direction of St. Fair's churchyard. Smart and lively he was then, not like what he was afore he died. I took a fancy for him as soon as I set my eyes on him. He was a man in those days, and I knowed a man when I saw one. I didn't care much for the looks of the other one. Remington was his name, as I heard afterwards. Well enough for some ties, but too good of the God Almighty Englishman about him to suit me. A handsome chap he was, this Remington, I'm bound to say, young and slim, with a pink face like a girl's, not a hair on it, and looking as though he might have turned out of a bandbox. Him, Turold, had a moustache, and his face was a dark one, but I liked him for all this black look, though not so black in those days either. More eager-like. Charles Turold found himself trying to picture Robert Turold in the part of a smart, lively young fellow, and failing utterly. But time took the smartness out of the man in less than 30 years. It had also taken the liveliness out of Robert Turold for good and all. Thalassa went on with his story. The young men were served with their beer at 5 shillings a bottle and sat down in a corner to drink it. They talked as they sipped, and Thalassa listened. His original idea that they were young men of wealth because of the base was soon dispersed by the trend of the conversation. They had gone out from England to make their fortunes on the fields, but had come a cropper like himself, and were discussing what they'd do next. The fair-haired one, Remington, was all for getting back to England while they had any money left, but Turold was dead against it. There were plenty of diamonds to be found, and he was going to have some of them. He had been talking to a man who was just back from the interior with a story of a river beach full of diamonds, and he was fitting up an expedition to go back and get them. Turold wanted to join in, but Remington said he had heard too many stories of diamonds to be picked up for the asking. Had he forgotten about the cursed Jew who got 100 pounds out of them? Turold said this was different. The man had brought back a little bottleful of diamonds. Remington replied with a sneer about salting. They argued. Suppose we drop the last of our money? Remington asked. No worse than crawling back to England like whipped curs, poorer than we set out, said the other. Remington said he didn't want to go back to England like that, but he'd sooner face it than run the risk of being stranded in that hell of a place. Turold answered he was not going back till he had made a fortune. He said, Thalassa remembered his exact words, I don't care how I do it, Remington, but I will do it, mark my words. Show me a more sensible plan than this, and I'm with you. Remington had replied. It was at this stage that Thalassa was seized with an inclination to thrust himself into the dialogue. Striving to explain his reasons at that distance of time, he said it was Robert Turold's last remark which really decided him, did the trick, as he phrased it. Actually, it must have been a prompt recognition of the kinship between two lawless souls. He left his seat and went across to where the two young Englishmen were earnestly talking, unaware that they had been overheard. He approached them as one shipwrecked sailor might approach two other castaways marooned on the same rock. They all wanted money, and they all wanted to get away from that god-forsaken hole. Diamonds they were after? Well, he could take them to a place at the other end of the world where there were enough diamonds in the rough to make them all rich for life. After the first surprise at his interruption, they heard him in silence and then plied him with questions. Where were these diamonds? In a volcanic island in the South Pacific. Whereabout? They couldn't expect him to tell them that. It was Robert Turold. Thalassa seemed to have addressed himself principally to him, who asked him how he knew that the diamonds were still there. Thalassa's reply was that they were buried in a big box and the island was out of the run of ships. What sort of a big box? Turold asked. Thalassa replied, perhaps reluctantly, that the box was a kind of a coffin, and there was a dead man inside it as well as the diamonds, but he, at all events, was not likely to run off with them. Remington and Turold were startled by this answer and conferred hastily apart. They returned to ask more questions. They wanted to know how the body and the diamonds had got there in the first instance, but that was a story which Thalassa refused to reveal. That had nothing to do with it, he said. The ship which had buried the man there had gone down afterwards with all hands, so nobody knew about the diamonds except him. After that, Remington became the chief questioner, Robert Turold merely looking on, his dark eyes frequently meeting Thalassa's. It seemed as though he must have realized that these last replies concealed a story better left unprobed. But Remington wanted to know why Thalassa had come searching for diamonds in that part of the world when he knew of plenty in another, and Thalassa had replied in all simplicity that it was because the Almighty had endowed him with more muscles than brains, and he hadn't recognized the worth of the stones at the time. In fact, he didn't know that they were diamonds. His experience in the fields had improved his knowledge in that respect, and he now knew that he had left behind him on the lonely island enough diamonds in the rough to make them all rich, 2 bottles full and some in a leather bag, where the dead man also kept one of those digging licenses which the damned German officials sold you. What do you call it? Prospector's license. A Chefchain? Said Remington. Yes, that was it. He knew it again as soon as he got one on the fields. Turold and Remington again talked together in whispers, and then Turold asked Thalassa how he proposed to get the diamonds. Thalassa had his plan ready. They must get down to the Cape and get a boat to Sydney from Cape Town. That was a jumping-off place. From Sydney they were to take a boat to another place. The island was a bare 2 days' sail from the other place, and Thalassa proposed to hire a cutter on the mainland and sail over to it. He was no navigator, but he could find his way back to that island again at any time. Turold seemed inclined to agree, but Remington put in another of his sharp questions. Why did he want to bring 2 strangers into the business? What was to prevent him getting the diamonds on his own account without sharing with anybody? Thalassa replied that he had no money to finance the expedition, and even if he got the diamonds, they'd be no use to him. How could a rough seaman like himself, who could hardly write his own name, turn the stones into the large sum of money they represented? That was an enterprise which called for civilized qualities of education and address which he did not possess. From his standpoint, it was an even deal between them. They were to supply the money and intelligence in return for his knowledge, and they would share and share alike. It was Robert Turold who ultimately settled the decision, winning over the reluctant Remington with words which Thalassa had never forgotten. He also recognized the risk, but he thought it was well worth taking. It seemed that the two had a little more than 200 pounds left between them, just about enough to carry the thing through. What was the use of returning to England with that paltry sum? He had asked. He spoke of a girl, some girl who was waiting in England for Remington while he made his fortune abroad. Was he going to go back to her penniless? Even if this doesn't turn out right, he went on, we'll have reached another part of the world with a fresh chance of making money instead of being poor in England, that breeding ground for tame rabbits where poverty is the unforgivable sin. I liked him for those words, said Thalassa, for they came from a man whose thoughts were after the style of my own. It was they, decided the other chap, and next morning we set out for Cape Town. From there we got passages in a cargo boat for Sydney. Charles found it easier to visualize this picture than the former. The departure of the 3 upon such a wild, romantic venture had in its elements all the audacity, greed and splendor of youth, and he also was young. Thalassa went on with his story. During the voyage to Sydney, Robert Turold asked to talk to him on deck at nights after Remington had gone to his bunk. It was in these solitary deck cramps under glittering stars that Thalassa first heard from the other's lips of the Turold title. The title for which the fortune he was seeking was merely a stepping stone, the means to obtain it. Night after night he talked of nothing else, said Thalassa, and I knew he would do what he wanted to do. It was easy to gather from his story that his original admiration for Robert Turold soon grew into a deeper and stronger feeling. There was something in the dead man's masterful, ambitious character which exercised a reluctantly conceded but undoubted fascination upon his companion's fierce spirit. Such were their relations when they reached Sydney and set out on a further voyage to the other place where Thalassa was so reluctant to name. On arriving at the other place, they made their way to its east coast, which was the starting point of their journey to the island. From a brown man living on the coast, Thalassa hired a smart little ketch which the 3 of them could easily handle, and in this they embarked for the island from a beach which curved like a white tusk around a blue bay. They did not reach the island for 6 days, through baffling winds, and not because they did not steer a right course. As Thalassa had said, there was no difficulty in finding it, for they had only been one day at sea when the smouldering smoke of the distant volcanic cone came into vision, making an unholy mark against the clear sky which they never lost again. Gradually they beat nearer until they made it, a circular, ragged, high ridge jutting abruptly from a deep sullen sea, with a red glow showing fitfully in the smoke of the summit. There was an outer reef, but Thalassa knew the passage and steered the ketch through a tortuous channel above sunken needle-pointed rocks to a little sheltered harbour inshore. Here they made the ketch fast and landed on a beach of volcanic violet, where they sometimes sank knee-deep into sulphuric water and felt squirming sea things squelch beneath their tread. Above this margin of violet-black sand, deposits of volcanic rock and lava rose almost perpendicularly, enclosing the central cone in a kind of amphitheatre. The stones they had travelled so far to obtain were there waiting for them. Thalassa hurried over that part of the story, narrating it in barest outline with suspicious glances directed at his listener's intent face. Apparently, he led his companions to the spot as soon as they landed, up a path through a gap in the crater wall, across a furrowed slope all a-quake, where jets of steam issued from gurgling fissures and snaky spirals. On the other side of this dreary waste, Thalassa led the way across a ledge to firmer ground and a grave. Charles gathered that the occupant of the grave had been coffined in a seaman's chest in his clothes. There he was, with his bottles of diamonds in his coat pockets, and more in his leather bag in his breast pocket, just as I left him 12 months before to go to the other end of the world looking for what I had buried. A grim smile curved Thalassa's face as he uttered these words. The idea seemed to contain elements of humour for him. "They were diamonds then?" said Charles curiously. "Aye, they were diamonds right enough." Turold said they were diamonds as soon as he uncorked one of the bottles and poured a few into the palm of his hand. There were some rare big ones in one of the bottles, enough to have brought all the fools tumbling out of Africa if they had known of them. From some papers they found on the chap, Turold said he must have been prospecting in nigh every part of the world. "How did he come to be buried with his diamonds in that lonely spot?" asked Charles wonderingly. "He was a passenger and died as he was passing the island. It was a skipper's fancy to give him a land burial. But that doesn't matter a dump. It's outside the story." He turned his eyes away from Charles. Dusk had fallen before they finished their search, and Thalassa would not undertake the risk of threading the boat out from the tortuous reef passage in the darkness. They decided to camp on the island for the night, preferring the sulphur-impregnated air. A lighted match would blaze and fizzle in like a torch, Thalassa declared, to the cramped discomfort of the little craft. They brought some food ashore and made a flimsy sort of camp above high water at the foot of the encircling walls of the crater. There they had supper, and there, as they lounged smoking, Remington, in an evil moment for himself, suggested that they should sort the diamonds into 3 heaps, share and share alike. Robert Turold agreed, and they emptied the stones out of the bottle and leather bag into a single heap. Remington took one bottle and Robert Turold another. To Thalassa fell the empty bag. As the stones were sorted, one was to be placed in each receptacle until the tally ran out. It must have been a strange spectacle, so strange that it made a lasting impression on the least imaginative mind of the 3, for he tried in his rude way to reproduce it on that Cornish beach after the lapse of 30 long years. He threw bits of rock on the sand to indicate the position in which they had sat. From his description, Charles pictured the scene adequately enough. The violet-black beach, exhaling sulphuric vapors, the yellow-grey volcanic rocks, the gurgling ebullitions of a geyser throwing off volumes of smoke high above them, and the faces of the 3 men, ruddy in the fireglow, white in the moonlight, intent on the division of the heap of dull stones scattered on a flat rock between them. Thalassa remembered all these things. He remembered also how startled they were, the 3 of them, at the unexpected sound of a kind of throaty chuckle nearby, and turned in affright to see a large bird regarding them from the shadow of the rocks, a sea-bird with rounded wings, light-colored plumage, and curiously staring eyes above a yellow beak. When it saw it was observed, it vanished swiftly seaward in noiseless flight. The division, commenced good-humouredly enough, soon developed the elements of a gamble between Robert Turold and Remington. They forgot Thalassa's existence as they argued and disputed over the allotment of certain stones. The foot or so of flat rock became the circumference of their thoughts, ambitions, and passions, their world for the time being. In that sordid drama of greed, Thalassa seemed to have comported himself with greater dignity than his two superiors by birth and education. He even took it upon himself to reason with them on their folly. Perhaps he knew from his own seamy experience of life what such things developed into. At all events, he urged his companions to defer the division until they returned to civilization and could get the spoils appraised by eyes expert in the knowledge of precious stones. But they would not listen. So, not liking the looks of things, he withdrew a little distance off and watched them leaning against a rock. That was his tacit admission. So Charles interpreted this action, that he was on Robert Turold's side, and felt that his own interests were identical with those of the mastermind. The two, left to themselves, wrangled more fiercely than ever. There were unpleasant taunts and mutual revilings. The listener by the rock learned definitely what he had previously suspected, that there was bitter blood and bad feeling between the two men, buried for a time, but now revived with a savageness which revealed the hollowness of their supposed reconciliation. It was about a girl, some girl in England with whom they had both been in love. Thalassa gathered that Remington had left England as the favoured suitor. He had, in Thalassa's words, cut Turold out. Charles Turold could not forbear a faint exclamation of astonishment. His brain reeled in trying to imagine the austere figure of Robert Turold squabbling over a girl and some diamonds on a lonely island in the South Pacific. He was too amazed at the moment to see the implications of this part of the story. They went on snarling and showing the teeth, but not biting, continued Thalassa, sorting out the little stones all right, but quarrelling over the bigger. There was two, the biggest in the bunch by far, which they kept putting aside because they couldn't agree about the sharing of them. At last it came about that there was only these two big ones left, lying like two beans on the bit of rock side by side. Before I could guess what was likely to happen, Turold grabbed them up quick and put them in his bottle. "These two are mine, Thalassa's and mine," he said. "You have had your share, Remington." Remington sprang from the rock quick as a snake. "One is mine," he said. But Turold was up as quick. "It's not for you," he said with his dark smile. "We'll put it against the girl you filched from me and call it an even deal. What does a happy lover want with diamonds?" "Damn you," cries the other and hit him in the face. They both went down scuffling and panting in the sand. I stood where I was, for I weren't going to come between them till I saw how it was going to be. Presently I could see that Remington was stronger and that Turold was getting the worst of it. After a bit, Turold called out, "Thalassa!" I ran down at that fast enough and got out my knife as I went. They had slipped down the sloping beach halfway to the sea, writhing like a couple of blind worms that kept stepping on, going over and over so quickly that I couldn't do anything at first. But one of them was sobbing in his breath as though he was pretty well finished, and I guessed it was Turold. Then I saw Remington's face and top, and before they could swing round again, I got a good stroke in his neck where it gleamed white in the moonlight. The blood jumped out warm on my hand, and he rolled over so quickly that I thought I had killed him. But as I stooped over him, he was up like a flash, staggering up the steep beach, his feet plopping and sucking in the water beneath. Turold was on his feet by that time, breathing hard, getting back his breath. "After him, quick," he says to me, his face black with rage. "He's got the diamonds." I ran after him up the beach, but he heard me coming and had the start of me. He had firm ground under him by then, and was staring along the rocks towards the path I had taken them that afternoon, turning round now and again to look back, and blood glistening in the moonlight on his white face. There he was, him going higher and higher, me after him, and Turold standing below on the beach, staring up at the two of us. Run my best, I couldn't get near him. I suppose he thought he was done for it if I caught him, and by that time my blood was pretty well up. I had one pull over him. I knew the island, and he didn't. The path he was taking led to the top of the island, where the crater was, with a kind of wall of rocks around it. But before you came to that, there was a great hole which fell down, God Almighty knows how deep, and was supposed to have been another volcano at some time or other. This hole was divided into two by a narrow bridge running right across it, and the path Remington was on took him straight to the edge. So he would either got to go across this ridge when he came to it, or turn back and be caught. He was a long way ahead when he came to it, but he never stopped. He just gave one glance down at me and went on to the ridge. I watched him balancing along it like a man on a tightrope, mounting higher and higher, for the ridge went up steep on the far side. Thinks I to myself, you are a plucky one. Then, all of a sudden, I heard a shout from below and looked on. There stood Turold, waving me out of the way. He had been to the boat for a gun we had brought with us and was taking aim at Remington. The next thing I saw was Remington turning round on the ledge to come back to my side, having found out, I suppose, that the ridge could take him into the crater. Just as he turned, I heard the shot. It must have winged Remington pretty bad, because he went tumbling off the ridge head first, like a man taking a dive into the water. I turned and climbed down to where I had left Turold. His face was all aglow with rage. "The infernal scoundrel," he said. Then, "Did you get the diamonds?" "How was I to get them when I never caught him?" I said. "Then we'll get them off his body in the morning," he said in a low tone. "You'll never do that," says I. He asked me why not, turning on me a face as savage as a dog's. "Because whichever side he is dropped, he is safe from us," I said. "There's a hole that no man's ever seen the bottom of on one side of the ridge, and on the other a stinking lake of green boiling sulphur. When you shot him, you sent him into one or the other, so you can say good-bye to him and the diamonds." "Oh," he cries when he heard that, just like that. Then, after a bit, he points up the path and asks me to go back and have a look for him. I went back as far as the ridge. The moon was clear as day, shining on that infernal green lake on the one side and into the deep hole on the other. The lake was bubbling and stewing in the moonlight like a witch pot, and the other side of the ridge was just black emptiness, and there was no sign of Remington. I knowed there couldn't be. Back I went again, and as I was climbing down the path to where Turold was standing, I saw something glinting in the black sand at his feet, and when I got there, I picked up the bottle of diamonds where Remington must have dropped them when struggling with Turold. I gave them to Turold. "And now," says I, "let's get out of here. The moon's bright enough to let me find my way through the reefs, and this island ain't a healthy place to stay too long on." "I know it, and you don't." He was glad enough to follow me to the boat, and we got through on a good flowing tide. Thalassa stopped abruptly, as though to leave on his listener's mind an impression of that furtive departure on a dark, whispering sea beneath a blood-red moon. "You got back to the mainland?" queried Charles, as he remained silent. "Aye, and to England. Afore we got there, Turold had persuaded himself that Remington slipped off the ridge accidental, and that he missed him when he fired. Perhaps his conscience pricked him. Go on." "There's not much more to tell. Turold got me my share of the money, and then we parted. He offered to invest it for me, but I wasn't going to trust no banks, not I. It took me 2 years to waste it on gambling and women. Then I took to sea again. That lasted another year. Then I found myself in Frisco, where I shipped in a 4-masted bark and came home round the Horn. I was pretty sick of the sea after 2 bad goes of rheumatic fever, so I made up my mind to hunt up Turold. I found him after a while. He didn't seem best pleased to see me at first, but he said I could stay till he had time to think out what he could do for me. That was the beginning of it. We never parted again, him and me, until he was carried out of yon house feet first. We got used to each other's ways, and it was worth all he paid me because I saved him worry and expense. He was all for saving in those days. Married he was too, to a little timid thing of a girl who was in fear and trembling of him. It was a black day for her when she married that headstrong, stubborn devil. Mr. Thalassa, she always called me, poor woman. I married a maidservant they had. That was Turold's idea. He thought by that way he could get his household looked after very cheaply by the pair of us. I wasn't keen on marrying, but it didn't make much odds one way or the other, for no living woman, wife or no wife, would have kept me in England if I had wanted to get out. As it happened, I never did. I stayed on, going from place to place where they went, where Turold took us. "Whom did my uncle marry?" asked Charles. "You might have guessed that. It was the girl the other had cut him out of. I thought the masterful devil would get her when Remington was out of the way, but I asked him once straight out, and he said yes, it was the same girl. She was a pretty timid little thing in those days, but I don't know why they was both so mad after her. However, there it was." "And do you think that after all these years Remington is really alive?" said Charles, looking at him earnestly. "Do you think it was he who murdered my uncle?" "Happen maybe, happen not. The night he was killed, I found him in a rare funk in his room. He rang his bell like a fury, and when I went up, he swore he heard footsteps of Remington just afore running round the rocks outside of Flint House, just as he heard him pattering along the rocks on the island that night. I didn't believe him then, but I'm not so sure since. If he has come back to get Turold, it's for sure he is still somewhere about, waiting his chance to get me as well. I'm keeping my eye open for one, walk the coast for miles I have, looking for him. He won't take me unawares, same as Turold. His eyes searched the cliffs behind them. You may not recognize him if you met him. It's 30 years since you saw him. A man changes a lot in 30 years. That's true. It's a thought which never crossed my mind. Thalassa's look was troubled. As you've told me the story, you'd better leave it in my hands and not go looking for anybody with that knife of yours. What be you doing to do? I must go to Scotland Yard and tell them your story. It's your only chance. And get me into trouble? There's not much fear of that. In any case, you must stand that for Cicely's sake. Thalassa nodded his acquiescence. Better be careful yourself getting back to London. The police here is watching for you. They've been at Flint House more than once looking for both of you. It's a risk I must take nevertheless, said the young man, rising from his seat as he spoke. It's for Cicely's sake. Goodbye, Thalassa, and thanks for what you have told me. Thalassa did not reply or offer to accompany him. From his seat on the rocks, he followed Charles' ascent up the narrow path with contemplative eyes. The end of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Moon Rock by Arthur J. Rees. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Moon Rock, Chapter 29. Barrett returned to London in the mental disposition of a man who sees an elaborate theory thrown into the melting pot by an unexpected turn of events. The humbling thought was that he had allowed a second fish to glide through his hands without even suspecting that it was on his line. He had never remotely connected Charles Turold with the murder until Mr. Brimstone had imparted Mrs. Brearley's disclosure to him. He had acted promptly enough on that piece of information, but once again he was too late. Austin Turold might have felt reassured if he had known how little his share in the events of that night occupied Barron's mind during their last interview. The complexion Austin's conduct bore to the detective's reflection was that of a father who had intentionally misled the power of authority in order to shield his son. The law took a serious view of that offense, but it was a matter which could be dealt with at leisure in Austin's case. By his brother's death, Austin Turold had become a man of property and standing. It was the drawback of his wealth that he could not disappear like his son. He was to be found when wanted. The main thing just then was to catch the son or the girl or both. Barrett went back to London for that purpose. As the days slipped away without that end being achieved, he became worried and perplexed. His own position was an unenviable one, and his thoughts were far from pleasant. He felt that he had failed badly, and that his standing with his superiors in Scotland Yard was under a cloud in consequence. But he could not see where he had actually been at fault. It was such a damned amazing case. In most crimes, the trouble was to find sufficient clues, but in this case, there were too many, and the inferences pointed different ways. That was the trouble. He was not even sure that in this latest discovery, so annoyingly belated, he had reached the ultimate solution of the facts. It was not that the theory of these two young people committing murder for love was too cynical for belief. He had encountered more incredible things than that in his professional career. Life was a cynical business, and youth could be brutal in pursuit of its aims, especially when the aim was passion, as it usually was. In his experience, youth and age were the dangerous periods. Youth because it knew nothing of life, and age because it knew too much. There were fewer surprises in middle age. That was a period of responsibility when humanity clung to the ordered way with the painful rectitude of a procession of laden ants toiling up a hill. Youth was not like that, nor age. No, it was not that. His difficulty was to fit all the circumstances into any compact theory of the case. Try as he would, there was always some loose end left over, some elements of uncertainty which left him perplexed. He fashioned a new view of the murder, with Charles Turold as a principal figure in it, the actual murderer. He assumed that Charles and Cicely had gone to Flint House that night to prevent the truth about Cicely's birth becoming known. The assertion of her illegitimacy rested upon her father's bare statement, but his lawyer was convinced he would not have made the statement without having the proofs in his possession. These proofs had not been found. Very well. What inference was to be drawn from that? Cicely knew that they were kept in the clock case and pointed out the hiding place to her lover. In a struggle for their possession, Robert Turold was shot down, or he might have been shot first and staggered to the clock afterwards to see if they had been stolen. Either supposition accounted for the fallen clock and fitted in with nearly all the known facts of the murder. Nearly all, but not all. In face of Mrs. Brierly's disclosure, it seemed a condition precedent to the elucidation of the mystery to substitute Charles Turold for Thalassa as a person whose undisciplined love for Cicely had led him to shoot her father to shield a name. Nor was it incredible to suppose that he had remained in Cornwall to cover her flight in the hope of diverting suspicion from her. But the loose end in the theory was Thalassa's share in that night's events, and his dogged silence sense and a strong suspicion. Thalassa knew more than he had yet revealed, but what did he know? What was his share in the business? It was difficult to say. Barrett was unable to accept the assumption that 3 people were concerned in the murder. That idea, if not impossible, was at least contrary to reason. But if it was excluded, how was the silence of Thalassa to be explained? Was he afraid? It was as difficult to associate that quality with him as with an eagle or beast of prey. And the theory failed to explain the reason for Robert Turold's frantic letter to his lawyer on the night of the murder. That was another loose end. What a case! It was an abnormal and sinister mystery in any light, with no absolute or demonstrative certainty of proof by any of its circumstances, however regarded. The effect of its perplexing clues distorted the imagination, outraged the sense of possibility and experience. To reach conclusiveness in it seemed as impossible as an attempt to scale an unending staircase in a nightmare. The facts were there, but they were inexplicable, or at least they stared at him with the aspect of many faces. As he weighed these doubts, he found his thoughts reverting with increasing frequency to the hoot clock in Robert Turold's study and the question of its connection with the crime. He pondered over the point with the nervous anxiety of a puzzled brain, and it seemed to him now that he had not devoted as much investigation to this peculiar clue as it deserved. He recalled Mr. Brimstone's conversation on the matter. He remembered that he had been struck at the time by the penetration of his remarks about the clock, and while not accepting his fantastic theory, had determined to give more careful thought to the point. But Mrs. Brierly's disclosure put the idea out of his head. It recurred to him with renewed force when he found himself in Exeter nearly a fortnight later on another case. It was a good opportunity to go to Cornwall, and he took it. His business completed, he caught the early train, and in due time arrived at Penzance. With an obscure instinct for solitude, he hastened through the town and struck out across the moors. The afternoon was wanting when he reached Flint House and pulled the old-fashioned bell-handle of the weather-beaten door. There was no reply, and a second ring passed disregarded. That was disconcerting and unexpected. He wondered whether Thalassa and his wife had left the place. Then he noticed that the door was merely closed and not shut. He lifted the heavy iron knocker and knocked loudly. The repeated knocking sent the door flying open, and Barrett found himself looking into an empty hall. Halfway down, a pair of curtains stirred slightly and parted suddenly, revealing a narrower passage which led to the door of the kitchen. The curtains streamed horizontally, twisting and coiling like snakes. Barrett stepped quickly inside and closed the door. The curtains fell together again. There was something so startling in this action of the wind that Barrett stood motionless, looking round him. The cold current of air he had admitted died away in the draughty passages with queer gasping noises like a wind strangled. Then there was the most absolute silence. The curtains hung perpendicular, as thickly motionless as blankets. Barrett noticed that the hall stand and a chair beside it was thick with dust. Evidently the house was empty. Turning first to make quite sure that the front door was securely shut, he took his way upstairs to Robert Turold's study. A point of light falling through the shattered panel of the closed door pierced the vague gloom of the passage and hovered on the door of the bedroom opposite, the room into which the dead man had been carried. Barrett entered the study and looked about him. It was intolerably dirty and neglected. Everything was covered with a thick grey dust. Barrett walked over to the clock and regarded it attentively. What a rascally fat face that moon had! It must have seen some queer sights in old houses during its 200 years of life. Strange that those old clockmakers could make clocks to last so long but couldn't keep their own life springs running half the time. The moral verse was curious enough. Why should a man who spent half his lifetime putting together a clock presume to tell his fellow creatures to make the most of the passing hour? The reflections took a more practical turn. The clock was a sole witness to the time of the murder. There were 2 other clocks in Flint House, but nobody had thought of looking at them when the crime was discovered. Barrett regarded that as a regrettable oversight. It was always important to know the exact time when a murder was committed. Thalassa said that the Hood clock was going and kept excellent time, but the value of that secondary testimony was impaired by the fact that Thalassa might not be telling the truth. On the other hand, there was certain presumptive evidence which suggested that he was. It was a proved fact that Mr. and Mrs. Pendleton and Dr. Ravenshaw left the doctor's house in a motor car for Flint House not later than 9:30 on the night of the murder. Assuming that they covered the journey across the moors in 5 or 6 minutes and occupied another 5 minutes in getting upstairs and breaking in the door, the testimony of the Hood clock seemed correct, because Dr. Ravenshaw said death had just taken place, and he and the doctor who made the post-mortem examination were both agreed that Robert Turold could not have lived many minutes after he was shot. Therefore, the presumptive evidence seemed to determine the time of death accurately enough. But that was only a minor phase of the mystery. The real problem was the hidden connection between the clock and the murder. What had brought the clock down, and why had Robert Turold fallen almost on top of it, his outstretched hands resting on the dial? The complete elucidation of the mystery lay behind the obscurity in which these 2 points were shrouded. To find the answer to them was the surest and quickest way of reconciling all the contradictory facts of the case. But Barrett raked his brains for the reason in vain. He examined the room. There was a leather-topped writing table with drawers, several cabinets filled with manuscripts and papers, some walnut chairs with carved legs, and a tall, deep bookcase filled with dreary-looking books. His eyes wandered over the titles of the volumes. They also belonged to a bygone period, a melancholy accumulation of works as dead as their writers. 2 whole shelves were occupied with the numbers of a forgotten periodical which claimed to give ample details of the unhappy difference between Queen Caroline of Great Britain and her consort George IV. Barrett wondered idly why human nature was always so interested in the washing of dirty linen. Above these was ranged a row of published sermons. Barrett's eye roamed higher and fell on a fat, sturdy volume wedged in between some slimmer books. The title of this book was called Clocks of All Periods. Clocks. He reached for the volume and placed it on the table. A cursory glance through the pages conveyed the suggestion that it contained more information about clocks than was worth acquiring or writing down. There was a chapter on water clocks to begin with. Known to the Egyptians and the Holy Land, Barrett turned the leaves. The ancient Chinese used a smouldering wick as timekeeper. Barrett shook his head impatiently. King Alfred's supposed device of measuring time by candles, a myth. Would to heaven his invention of juries was a myth too. Scotland Yard would get on much better without them. A lamp clock was another simple and ingenious design. How intolerably long-winded the writer was. What had he to say about Hood clocks? Very few of the early clocks had dials. The device was generally a mechanical figure which struck the hour on a bell, evidently the forerunner of the devilish alarm clock. Early clockmakers, old English monks as clockmakers. The pages flowed rapidly through Barrett's fingers. Introduction of minute hand marks, period of clocks showing tides, long-faced clocks. Ah, here it was at last. Hood clocks. He began to read the chapter with interest, but as he was about to turn the first page, the silence of the room was broken by a faint, cackling laugh, an elfin sound which died away instantly. He looked up, startled. His surprise was not lessened at the sight of Mrs. Thalassa watching him from the open doorway. She entered on tiptoe with a strange air of caution, examining him with restless eyes. "I heard you," she mumbled. "I saw you go upstairs. Mr. Thalassa was out, and I was afraid to go to the door. I've been playing patience, and it won't come out. She showed an apron full of small cards. She placed them on the table and arranged them in rows. A new idea came into Baron's mind as he looked at her. If the poor creature had recovered sufficient wits to take to her cards again, she might be coaxed to recall what she had seen on the night of the murder. He drew near her. "Can I help you?" he said. She nodded sideways at him like a child with withered face and grey hair. Together they bent over the cards. A gull flashed past the window with a scream, as though it had seen them and was repelled at the strange sight. "Only kings can go into vacant spaces," murmured Baron's companion, intent on the game. The result of the game was inconclusive. A king remained surrounded by small cards like a real monarch overwhelmed by the rabble on May Day. Mrs. Thalassa's eyes strayed mournfully over the rows. Then she gathered up the cards and shuffled them again. "Do you know any other games of patience?" Baron asked. She shook her head. "Then this is the game you were playing on that night?" "What night?" she whispered. "The night Mr. Turold was killed?" "I don't want to think of that. It frightens me." She remembered then. Her face went grey, but her eyes were alert, watching his. "Listen to me," he spoke very gently. "I want to help you to get rid of your fear and terror, but to do so I must talk to you about that night. Do you understand?" The kindness in his voice seemed to reach a feeble consciousness, and she looked at him earnestly. "Would you try and recollect?" She seemed to search his eyes for courage, and gave a trembling nod. "What time was it when you heard the crash upstairs? Think well." She seemed to make an effort to remember. "I don't know," she said at last. "Think again. You were playing patience, the game you have just shown me?" Her eyes turned to the cards on the table. "Yes," she said. "What time did you commence? Can you think?" She shook her head. "I seem to remember it was 8:30 by the kitchen clock when I started my last game. I was alone in the kitchen then. The game was just coming out when I heard a crash." She broke off suddenly with a painful sigh and a frightened glance at the hood clock on the wall. "One game." Baron glanced at his watch with an air of mistrust. "You mean 2, don't you?" Her eyes turned to his. She shook her head with a rapid, tremulous motion. "No," she exclaimed excitedly. "Only 1." Baron cast another glance at his watch, which he still held in his hand. "You are quite sure you did not play 2?" he persisted with a puzzled glance. No, 1." She sprang to her feet excitedly. "Very well, 1," acquiesced Baron soothingly. "1. Go on." But his effort to calm her came too late. She cast a wild and fearful glance at the wall behind her, as if there was something there which frightened her. "How it rings! How it rings!" Her indistinct utterances grew louder. "Yes, Jasper, I hear. Yes, sir, I'm coming. Where's the supper tray?" "Don't be afraid, Mrs. Thalassa," said Baron, approaching her, but she backed hurriedly away towards the door. "Coming with the supper tray. Coming with the supper tray. What's that? Ah!" Her disjointed mutterings ended in a shrill scream which went ringing through the stillness and seemed to linger in the room after she had disappeared. Baron heard her muttering and laughing as she descended the stairs. The sounds died away into a silence so absolute as to suggest the impression of a universe suddenly struck dumb. Baron crossed the room to the window, where he stood looking out, deep in thought. What was the meaning of it all? Of this latest scene in particular? The game of patience, so tempestuously concluded, had occupied half an hour. He had noted the time. Yet Mrs. Thalassa insisted she had played only 1 game after 8:30 on the night of the murder. If he dared accept such a computation of time, an unimagined possibility in the case stood revealed. But a demented woman, a parable in the mouth of a fool. Perhaps it was because she was a fool that he had stumbled on this revelation. She lacked the wit to lie about it. If so, his eyes, straying incuriously over the outstretched panorama of sea and cliffs beneath the window, fell upon a man's outline scaling the cliff path near the moon rock. Disturbed in his meditations, Baron watched the climber. He reached the top and appeared in full view on the bare summit of the cliffs. Barent stared down upon him, amazed beyond measure. The advancing figure was Charles Turold. The end of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The Moon Rock by Arthur J. Rees. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Moon Rock, Chapter 30. Barent hastened from the room downstairs to the front door. From the open doorway he saw Charles Turold advancing across the rocks in the direction of the house, and he ran swiftly down the gravel path to intercept him. Charles looked up and came on as if there was nothing to turn back. His clear glance dwelt on the figure by the gate without fear, with seeming gratification. Barent was amazed. He had been prepared for an attempt at flight, but not this welcoming look. Never before had he known a man show joy at the prospect of arrest. The experience was so disturbing that he went across the intervening space to meet Charles and laid a hand upon his arm. "I suppose you know you are wanted by the police?" he said. "I am aware of it," was the quiet reply. "I was going to give myself up." "Did you come back to Cornwall for that purpose?" asked the detective, shooting another puzzled glance at him. "I have come back to try and discover the truth." "About what?" "About my uncle's death." "And you have discovered it?" "I have." Barent did not understand the young man's attitude or the tone of heartfelt relief in which he uttered these words, but he felt that the conversation in its present form had gone far enough. "Do you suppose to tell me the truth?" he asked, with a slight cynical emphasis on the last word. "I do." Barent's surprise kept him silent for a moment, but when he spoke he was very incisive. "In that case, it's my duty to warn you." "There is no need to warn me," Charles quickly interrupted. "I know. Any statement I make will be taken down and used against me. That's the formula, isn't it? Or something to that effect. Let us go into the house. My story will take some time in the telling." He made this request as a right rather than a favor, and Barent found himself turning in at the gate with him. In silence they walked to the house, and it was Charles Turold who led the way to the sitting room. "It was here it began," he murmured, glancing round the deserted apartment. "And it seems fitting that the truth should be brought to light in the same place." "Provided that it is the truth," commented his companion. Charles did not reply. They had been standing face to face, but he now drew a chair to the table and sat down. Barent walked to the door and locked it before seating himself beside him. "You can begin as soon as you like," he said. "I think I had better tell you about my own actions first of all on that night," said Charles after a brief silence. "It will clear the way for what follows. I was up here that night, the night of the murder." "I know that much," was Barent's cold comment. "You suspected it. You did not know it," Charles quickly rejoined. He remained profoundly silent for a moment, as if meditating his words, and then plunged into his tale. The account of his own visit to Flint House on the night of the murder he related with details withheld from Cicely. The visit was the outcome of a quarrel between father and son over Robert Turold's announcement about his wife's previous marriage. Charles was shocked by his uncle's decision to make the story public, and had wandered about the cliffs until dark trying to decide what to do. Ultimately, he returned home and asked his father to use his influence with his brother to keep the secret in the family. His father called him a fool for suggesting such a thing, declined to offend his brother or blast his own prospects by such damned quixotic nonsense. On this, Charles had announced his intention of seeing his uncle and telling him he would leave England immediately and forever unless the scandal was kept quiet. That made his father angry, and they quarreled violently. Charles cut the quarrel short by flinging out of the house in the rain to carry out the intention of interviewing his uncle. He walked across the moors to Flint House. The front door was open, the downstairs portion of the house in darkness, and his uncle lying upstairs in his study. He hurried over all of this as of small importance in the deeper significance of Thalassa's story. That was to him the great thing, the wonderful discovery which was to clear Cicely and put everything right. He believed that the plan which had brought him to Cornwall was working splendidly. The chance encounter with the detective was really providential, a speeding up, a saving of valuable time. The possibility of disbelief did not dawn upon him. He overlooked that his listener was also his custodian and judge, the suspicious arbiter of a belated story told by one whose own actions were in the highest degree suspicious. His overburdened mind forgot these things in the excitement of hope. He talked with candor and freedom of one young man confiding in another. When he had finished, he looked at his companion expectantly, but Barron's eyes were coldly official. "A strange story," he said. "A true one," Charles eagerly rejoined. "Thalassa has been walking along the coast ever since in the expectation of finding this man. He will kill him if he meets him." It was Barron's lot to listen to many strange stories which are always true according to the narrators, but generally they caused him to feel ashamed of the poverty of human invention. He was not immediately concerned to discover whether Thalassa's story was true or false, or whether it had been concocted between him and Charles with the object of deceiving the authorities. The consideration of that infamous brown-faced scoundrel's confession could be postponed, if it had ever been made. The present business was with Charles Turold. There was something infernally mysterious in his unexpected reappearance in that spot. He had gone to London when he had disappeared. He admitted that. What had brought him back? To see Thalassa, as he said, in order to try and get at the truth. Nonsense. He, Barrent, was not simple enough to believe that. What then? Barrent was not prepared to supply a ready answer to that question. But his trained ear had detected many gaps in the young man's own narrative which filled in might give it. Turold knew more than he had said. He was keeping things back. Again, what things? Behind him stood the shadowy figure of the girl and her unexplained flight. Barron's instinct told him that Charles was shielding her. He turned to the task of endeavoring to reach the truth. "Let's go back a bit," he said casually. "You have left one or two points in your own story unexplained. What about the key?" "The key?" Charles started slightly. "I mean the key of the room upstairs. You said you found the key in the passage outside. You must have locked the door after you had taken it away with you." "I did," replied the young man in some hesitation. "For what reason?" Charles realized that he was on very thin ice. In his intense preoccupation with Thalassa's story, he had forgotten that his own impulsive actions on that night might be construed as proof of his own guilt or bear too literal interpretation of having been done to shield Cicely. He saw that he was in a position of extraordinary difficulty. "I was hardly conscious of what I was doing at the time," he said. "You took the key away with you?" Charles nodded with a feeling that the ice was cracking beneath him. "And how did it get back into the room afterwards?" Charles paused to consider his reply, but the detective supplied it. "The inference is fairly obvious," he said. "The key was found inside the study after the locked door was burst open. It was your father who found it on the floor. At least, he pretended to find it there. It was your father who started the suicide theory." He paused, then added in a smooth, reflective voice, "Really, the whole thing was very ingenious. It reflects much credit on both of you." Charles spoke with an air of sudden decision. "My father did these things to shield me," he said. "I did not want to reveal that, but I see that the concealment will only direct unmerited suspicion on him. When I returned from Flint House that night, I let myself in with my latchkey and went straight to my bedroom. My clothes were wet through, and I lit a fire in my room to dry them. As I was spreading them out in front of the blaze, the key of the study dropped out of the waistcoat pocket onto the floor. I had forgotten all about it till then. I picked it up and placed it on the mantelpiece. Some time after I was aroused by my father entering the room, he had come to tell me of my uncle's death. The news had just arrived from Flint House. His face was very white. "Your uncle has been found dead, shot in his study," he said. I had jumped up when he came in and was standing in the center of the room. As he spoke, his eyes traveled past me or to my wet clothes in front of the fire, and then returned to my face with a strange expression. "Did you go to Flint House?" he asked sharply. I could only nod. "And did you see him, your uncle?" was his next question. On that, I told him the truth. I told him what I had found. I told him about locking the door and showed him the key on the mantelpiece. He slipped it in his pocket, then returned and gave me a terrible look. "I am going over to Flint House," he said, "but you had better stay here," and he left the room. "What time did you reach the Flint House that night?" said Barrent. Charles Turold realized that the critical moment had come. He had foreseen it when he saw the detective standing at the gate of the Flint House. The relation of Thalassa's story to Barrent had carried with it the inevitable admission that Cicely was at Flint House on the night of her father's death. The point Charles had to decide was whether he should divulge the additional information that he had seen her leave Flint House with Thalassa on that night. As he covered the space which intervened between him and Barrett waiting to the gate, he decided that the moment had come to tell all he knew. "I know now that it couldn't have been much after 8:30, he said in reply to Barrett's question. "Did you see Miss Terrell there?" "I was coming to that. I was standing outside, considering what I would say to my uncle when the door opened and she and Thalassa came out." "Did you speak to them?" "I went to do so, but they disappeared in the darkness of the moors before I could reach them. I hastened after them, but I got off the road track and wandered about the moors for nearly half an hour before I could find my way back to Flint House." "And found the door open and your uncle lying dead upstairs?" "Yes." "Why have you not come forward with this story before?" "How could I expect anyone to believe a story which sounds improbable in my own ears? Even my father refused to believe it, then or afterwards. Still, you might have cleared Miss Turold on the question of time. There was a stop clock, you know. You reached Flint House shortly after 8:30 and went upstairs 30 minutes later." Charles Turold was subtle enough to see that this remark covered more than a trap. It suggested that Barrett discredited the whole of his story. The hood clock in the dead man's study had pointed to 9:30 on the night he was killed. Thalassa's story, as it stood, proved that Cicely must have left the house long before then. But Charles' own story threw suspicion back onto Cicely by suggesting that the police had been misled about the time of the murder, which must have been committed at least half an hour earlier than they assumed. Charles did not attempt to point out this supposed flaw in the detective's reasoning. He confined himself to a reply which was a strict statement of fact so far as it went. "Until I heard Thalassa's story today, I had no idea of the time of my own arrival at Flint House on that night," he said. "The clock found lying on the floor upstairs was stopped at 9:30, remarked Barrett with a reflective air, as though turning over all the facts in his mind. "According to the story told you by Thalassa, he and Miss Terrell left the house shortly after 8:30. Thalassa could not have returned until 9:30. He found the house in darkness, his wife lying unconscious in the kitchen, and his master dead upstairs. Thalassa, retracting his previous statement that he was not out of the Flint House that night, for the first time tells of some mysterious avenger who, he thinks, killed Robert Turold while he was out of the house with Miss Turold. Thalassa now suggests, if I understand you rightly, that this man Remington, wronged by Robert Turold many years before, was lurking outside in the darkness and seized the opportunity of Thalassa's absence to enter the house and murder the man who had wronged him. Have I got it right?" "Yes," said Charles, "you have it right. The story rests on Thalassa's bare statement, and Thalassa is a facile liar." Barrett's tone was scornful. "He is not lying now," returned Charles, "and there is more than his bare statement to support his story. Thalassa found his master cowering upstairs with fear in his study shortly before he met his death. He told Thalassa he had heard Remington's footsteps outside. Thalassa laughed at him, but undoubtedly Remington was out there waiting for his opportunity, which he took as soon as he saw Thalassa leave the house. If I had not followed Thalassa and Miss Turold, I might have seen him." "It's rather a pity you didn't." Barrett's voice was not free from irony. "For then you might have secured the proof which the present story lacks." "There are other proofs," Charles earnestly continued. "There were the marks on my uncle's arm, and the letter he wrote to his lawyer under the influence of the terror in which Thalassa found him, the fear caused by overhearing Remington's footsteps. Thalassa posted that letter." "Did he tell you so?" asked Barrett quickly. Then, as Charles remained silent, he went on, "How did you find out about the marks on your uncle's arm?" Charles hesitated before replying in a low voice. "I paid a visit to Flint House on the night after the murder." "For what purpose?" "To see if I could find out anything which might throw light on the mystery. I got in through a window and went upstairs. I saw the marks then." "Did you discover anything else?" "No. The dog started to bark and I left as quickly as I could." "I see." Barrett's voice was non-committal, followed after a pause by a quick change of tone. "I shall investigate the story later," he said coldly. "Meantime—" "Why not investigate it immediately?" asked Charles in a disappointed voice. "Thalassa will be back directly, or I can take you down to the cliffs where I left him." Barrett was reminded of the flight of time. It would be as well to remove Charles before Thalassa returned. Time enough for Thalassa's story later. At that moment it seemed to Barrett that the final solution of the mystery was almost in his hands. Mrs. Thalassa had been wiser than he. The single game of patience suggested the solution of the problem of the time. It did more than that. It seemed to provide the key of the greater problem of Charles Tyrrell's actions on that night. He had endeavored to shield Cecily by altering the hands of the clock. The rest, for the present, must remain mere conjecture. "One more question," he said. "Can you tell me where Miss Tyrrell is to be found?" "I know, but I am not going to tell you." Barron's eye rested on Charles. "You must come with me," he said. Charles nodded. Despairingly, he reflected that the interview had not turned out as he expected. There were other means, and he must be patient. And Cecily? There was anguish in that thought. The end of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The Moon Rock by Arthur J. Rees. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Moon Rock, Chapter 31. With a beating heart, Cecily gained the shelter of her room and locked the door, her eyes glancing quickly around her. She did not expect to see anything there, but she had reached the stage of instinctive terror when one fears lurking shadows, unexpected noises, or an imagined alteration in the contour of familiar things. There was nothing in the room to alarm her, and her thoughts flew back to the face of the man she had seen in the street outside. The owner of the face had leered at first, and then his glance hardened into suspicion as he looked. When she hurried past him, he had shifted his position to stare at her by the light of the street lamp. Had he followed her? That was the question she could not answer. She had heard footsteps behind her in the dark street, horrible, stealthy footsteps which had caused terror to rush over her like a flood and sent her flying along the street to her own heaven. As she ran, she had felt a touching faith in the security of her room if she could reach it. Out there in the open street, it had seemed impregnable like a fortress. Now, as she sat there, she had a revulsion of feeling. The room was not safe. The house was not safe. Not now. She had been very imprudent. She had run straight home to her hiding place, her only refuge. Why had she not waited to make sure that she was not followed? Then she could have slipped away in a different direction until she had evaded pursuit and returned to her room afterwards. She had been very foolish. She approached a window and gazed down, but could discern nothing in the darkness. She tried to shake off her fear, telling herself that it was imagination. But her mind remained full of misgivings, and her inner consciousness peopled the obscurity of the street below with lurking figures. Weariness overcame her. She retired from the window and lay down on a bed, not to sleep, but to think. Her fright had turned her mind temporarily from the contemplation of a greater disaster. That was the arrest of Charles Turold. She had learned the news from an evening paper she had bought at the corner of the street. The announcement was very brief, merely stating that he had been arrested at Cornwall. The guarded significance of the information was not lost upon her. Charles had been captured on his way back to her, and her agonized heart whispered that she was responsible for his fate. Bitterly she now blamed herself for having let him go on the quest. She hardly asked herself whether it had succeeded or failed, perhaps because she had subconsciously accepted the view that Thalassa, after all, had nothing to tell. Nor did she think of the calamity which had again overtaken her love. The effect of her original renunciation was still strong within her, and Charles' discovery of her and her promise to him had not really altered her attitude. His finding her and the subsequent conversation in the room below bore an air of the strangest unreality to her, as if she had been merely an actor in a stirring scene which did not actually affect her. Some subtle inward voice told her that these things did not matter to her. It was part of a feeling which she had always within her, the sense of living under the shadow of some dark destiny which would not be mitigated or withheld. It was a strange point of view for one so young, but it had been hers ever since she remembered anything. The tragedy and the shame which had come into her life recently had found her, as it were, waiting. She regarded them merely as the partial fulfillment of the unescapable thing which had been prepared for her before she was born and had dogged her lonely footsteps since childhood. In the isolated circumstances of her life and upbringings, It was not strange, perhaps, that she had such imaginings. She had loved Charles Turold with all the strength of a passionate, solitary nature, and it was this feeling or instinct of fatality which had given her the strength to renounce him. Indeed, it seemed to her that that inseparable companion of her inmost thoughts had prompted her to linger outside the door at Flint House on this afternoon so that she should overhear her father's words, catch that sinister fragment of a sentence which compelled her to refuse the love of Charles until she had learnt the truth. She could not listen to him with that secret half-guessed, and the full truth known, no other course was open to her save renunciation. She had not wavered. Sometimes, in the vain way of the young heart seeking for happiness, she found herself wishing that she had not listened at the door to those few words which sent her back to Flint House that awful night to learn the truth from her father, or at least had not acted upon them. The words she overheard had not told her much, and she might have tried to forget them. But she thrust that thought from her like an evil thing. She would have hated herself if she had followed that course and found out the truth of her birth afterwards, deeming herself unworthy of the love of one who had been ready to sacrifice everything for her sake. No, it was better, far better that she should know. She had not thought of suspicion falling on herself. Her youth and inexperience, borne upward on the lofty wings of sacrifice, had not foreseen the damning significance which might gather round a secret visit to Flint House and a subsequent disappearance. Not even when she heard of her father's death had the folly of her contemplated action dawned on her. Her dreamy, unpractical temperament, keyed up to the great act of abnegation, had not paused to consider what the consequences might be to herself. Lying there in the darkness of her room, she recalled how that revelation had been made to her. It was the first night after her arrival in London, in the drawing-room of a private hotel near Russell Square, where she had intended staying for a few days while she sought for some kind of employment. There was a group of women seated around the fireplace, talking. She was seated by herself some distance away, turning over the leaves of a magazine, when a loud remark by one of the speakers startled her into an attitude of listening fear. "Have you read about this Cornwall murder?" The words, cold and distinct, had broken into her sad reflections like a stone dropped from a great height. They had gone on talking without looking at her, and she had listened intently, masking her conscious features with the open magazine. It was all that she did. They discussed the murder in animated tones. The strangest case, a great title, the Turold title, to be heard before the House of Lords next week. And now the claimant was murdered. He was very wealthy too. Thus they talked. Then the first voice, which seemed to dominate all the others, broke in. "It was thought to be a suicide at first, but I see by tonight's paper that his daughter is suspected. She has disappeared and is supposed to have fled to London. What are girls coming to? Always shooting somebody or somebody shooting them. It's a war, I suppose." The shock of the double disclosure had been almost too much to bear. Till then she had not known that her father had been murdered, much less that she was suspected of killing. Dizziness had swept over her. Things seemed to spin round her, yet she saw them rotating with a kind of dreadful distinctness. The false smiling faces of the women, the furniture, a cat blinking at the hearthrug, an empty coffee cup on a small table. One stout lady, enthroned on a pile of red and blue cushions, sailed round and round on a sofa with the preposterous repetition and tragic reality of a fat woman on a roundabout. Then the circling faces and furniture vanished. She swayed with the sensation of growing darkness, and had the oddest fancy that the break of the waves on Cornish cliffs was sounding in her ears. She was dreamily inhaling the sea air. She had pulled herself sharply together. She had something of her father's tenacity and courage in her composition, and that had nerved her to face the ordeal and saved her from giving herself away. The darkness lightened, the electric lights danced dizzily back into view, and the room became stationary once more. With an effort at calmness, she rose from her seat and sought her room, and next morning she left the house. Henceforth her lot was one of furtive movement and concealment. As she lay there, staring open-eyed into the darkness, her thoughts slipped back to the night of her visit to Flint House in a vain effort to recollect some overlooked incident which might throw light on her father's mysterious death. There was one thing over which she had frequently puzzled without arriving at any interpretation of it. She thought of it now. She saw herself stealing from her father's room with the sound of his last awful words ringing through her being. Beneath, near the foot of the staircase, she could see Thalassa waiting, the glow of the tiny hall light falling on his stern, listening face. She was walking along the passage to go to him when some impulse impelled her to glance through a window which looked out on the moats and the rocks near the house. Her eyes had fallen on a shape shrouded in the obscurity of the rocks not far from the window, which seemed to have some semblance to the motionless figure of a man. She had stood there for a moment, glancing down intently, but it had not stirred. If it had human semblance, it seemed to be carved in stone. She came to the conclusion that she was mistaken. Experience had taught her what strange shapes the rocks took after nightfall. With another fleeting glance, she had hurried downstairs and from the house. She thought about it now without arriving at any conclusion as to what it was that she had seen so distinctly, whether man or rock. Charles had been up there that night, but it was not Charles. This figure or rock was on the other side of the house. Stupor descended gradually on her tired brain like the coming of darkness, and she fell into sleep, the first rest that had visited her since she learnt of Charles' arrest. But her slumber was disturbed by dreams. She dreamt that she was back in Cornwall, sitting on her old perch at the foot of the cliffs, looking at the moon rock. The face on the rock was watching her as it had always watched her, but this time with a dreadful sneer which she had never seen before. It frightened her so that she moaned and tossed uneasily and awoke with a cry, shaking with terror. As she reached out her hand for the matches by the bedside to light the gas, the sound of the front door bell pealed through the house. Cicely sprang up, her eyes seeking to pierce the darkness, her ears listening intently. Who could it be? She was alone in the house. Mrs. Johns had gone to one of her spiritualistic meetings and was not likely to be home until late. Besides, she had her own key, with which she always let herself in. She crept cautiously to the window and strained her eyes downward. She was just able to catch a glimpse of two vague figures underneath in the darkness. The light of the street lamp glinted on something one of them was wearing on his head. It was a policeman's helmet. The terror of the hunted took possession of her. She sought to remain calm. Her trembling lips essayed a sentence of a prayer, but it was no use. She was too young for philosophy or Christian resignation. Terror shook her with massive jaws. She did not want to be caught, to be put in prison, to be killed. She wandered aimlessly about the room like a trapped creature. She must escape. She would escape. With a great effort, she calmed herself to reflect, to calculate if there was any chance of getting away. She esteemed it fortunate that she had not lit the gas in her room. The whole house was in darkness. The policeman might think there was nobody in and go away, but she dare not reckon on that. There came another and louder ring of the bell downstairs. Again she crept to the window and looked down. The policeman and the other man were conferring in a murmur which reached her ears. The policeman stepped back into the garden path and scanned the darkened windows of the house. She shrank back from the window. The ring was followed by the sound of knocking of the front door, knocking heavy and prolonged, which reverberated solemnly through the silent house. Then once more there was silence. In her ignorance of the methods of the law, she wondered wildly whether the next step would be to break in the door and search the house. Terror shook her again at this thought, scorched her with burning breath. She would escape. She must. But how? Her fingernails pierced the palms of her hands as she vainly tried to think out a way. Should she hide somewhere? She rejected the plan as impracticable. The back way? But there was no outlet. Only a small garden abutting on other back gardens. There was a dark side street only a few houses away. If she could only reach it. She stood quite motionless, expecting the knocking to start again. But it did not. She thought she heard the shuffle of feet and husky whispers in the garden path underneath, but she could not be sure of that. What were they doing? Why were they so silent? Suppose they got in through the window, she whispered to herself. Her soul died within her at that thought. She tried to assure herself that the windows were locked, but her staring eyes peopled the invisible staircase with creeping figures. The darkness grew intense and terrifying, like a rushing black torrent flowing over her head. She was alone in an empty world. The torrent ceased, and the darkness took the form of a great sable wing, moving, flapping, seeking to enfold her. She put up her hands to ward it off. At that instant, a sharp and decisive sound reached her. It was the click of a shut gate. As she recognized the sound, a new thought came to her, a hope, when hope seemed gone. She stepped noiselessly to the window and looked on. She was just in time to catch a glimpse of two retreating figures revealed in dark contour beneath the rays of the street lamp. The next moment they passed out of sight. They had gone, but they would return. She felt sure of that. She must get away at once before they did. Run out of the door and make for the side street. She listened for a moment longer. There was no sound anywhere now. The house was lapped in absolute quietness. She felt for her hat and, calming her nerves with a desperate effort, stole quickly from the room and downstairs. As she stood in the silent hall facing the closed door, she again thought she heard whisperings. She recoiled in fear, wondering if they were outside waiting. It was her worst ordeal yet. Then desperation conquered her terror. Her trembling fingers pulled back the bolt, and she issued forth. There was no one there to check her flight. The street seemed empty. Without turning her head, she ran past the houses which intervened between her and the side street. She gained it and turned into its friendly darkness. She was as free as a bird again for the moment. A kind of exhaustion seized her at this unexpected deliverance from her adventure, but the mood passed as she reflected upon her present position. She had left the house without a few belongings, and what was far worse, without her money, which she kept in a handbag locked up in a small case in the bedroom she had just left. She had but a penny in the world and dared not go back. That was not the moment to reflect upon the grimness of her situation. The sound of approaching footsteps shaped her fears to capture her into renewed action. She walked rapidly away. The time was near midnight, and the streets were almost empty. She kept her way along dark, obscure streets, shunning the lighted thoroughfares. She had no settled plan in her mind, except to keep on. Hers was the instinct of the hunted creature for darkness and obscurity. Her fevered spirit hurried her along, spurring her with the menace of an imprisonment which was worse than the cramped horror of the grave. In the grave there was no consciousness of the weight of the earth above, but in prison, held like an animal, watched by horrible men, beating despairing hands against locked doors. Ah, no, no! Her free young body and soul revolted with nausea at the thought. Death would be better than that. She walked still more rapidly. With that possibility impending, she shrank from any chance contact with passers-by, turning into side streets to avoid anyone she saw coming. Once a policeman, appearing unexpectedly out of the shadows, set her heart beating wildly, but he passed by without looking at her. It grew later, and the streets became quite deserted. She had been walking for more than an hour when she noticed that the houses were scattered, with open spaces now and then, and a bracing freshness in the air which suggested that she was getting away from where the herds of London slept into open spaces. For some obscure reason, this made her nervous, and she turned back. After a while, London closed in on her again, but this time in a more squalid quarter, a wilderness of dirty, narrow streets, where even in the darkness the debasing marks and odor of squalid poverty were perceptible in the endless rows of houses which seemed to crowd in upon her. She came to a bridge and crossed it into an area of gaunt and darkened factories. Here, strange nocturnal noises and sights frightened her. She saw shadowy forms and heard rough voices on a wharf in the blackness of the river beneath her, followed by a woman's scream. She ran when she heard that, ran along the riverside till she came to another bridge, which she recrossed. She found herself in a quieter and better part of London, where the streets were wide and well kept, and she slackened her pace into a walk again. The night wore on like eternity, with immeasurable slowness, yet incredible swiftness. She had been walking for hours, and yet she had no feeling of fatigue. She seemed to move through the streets without any effort of her own. Towards the morning, she was carried along with a complete absence of bodily sensation, as if she had been in very truth one of those disembodied spirits of Mrs. John's spirit world, driven through the solitude of the ages by the implacable decree of some incalculable malignant force called immortality. She felt as though centuries of time had rolled over her head when the murk of the lowering sky lightened and the London dawn was born, naked and grey. The dawn brought London to life with a speed which was in the nature of a miracle. From the appearance of the first workers to the flocking of the streets was, as it were, but a moment. The buses and trams commenced running, and shops opened. Cicely found herself walking along Holborn, where the thickening crowds jostled her as she walked. But she did not care for that now, nor did she seek the comparative seclusion of the side streets. Her fear of capture had passed away, and her only feeling was impenetrable isolation and loneliness. The people who were passing had no more existence to her than if they had been a troop of ghosts. She had the sensation of belonging to another world and could not have communicated with them if she had wished. But the spirit which had sustained her during the night disappeared with the clamorous advance of the day. She became in an instant conscious of the grievous pang of a body which seemed to have been flung back to her in a damaged state. It ached all over. Her head throbbed with a dull buzzing sound, and she was so tired that she could hardly stand. She felt as if she must lie down, in the street, anywhere, and she was tormented by thirst. But she still kept on. She found herself after a while by one of those little backwaters which are the salvation of strangers to London, a green-railed square with trees and fountains, and a quiet pavement where a street artist was drawing bright pictures with crayons. An old four-wheeler was moored in the gutter by the entrance, the horse munching in the depths of a nose-bag, the elderly driver reclining against the side of the cab, smoking and watching the pavement artist. Cicely entered the empty square to rest herself. As she sat there on one of the wooden seats, the full misery of her situation came home to her, and she asked herself anxiously what she was to do. She had nowhere to go, and no money to buy food or shelter, nothing in the world that she could call her own except the clothes she was wearing. They were the coat and skirt she had put on to come to London, and she noticed with feminine concern that the dark cloth showed disreputable stains and splashes on a night's exposure. Hastily she took a handkerchief from her pocket to remove the telltale marks. As she did so, a bit of buff cardboard fluttered on to the gravel at her feet. She stooped and picked it up. It was a return half of a ticket to Cornwall. The remembrance of her arrival at Paddington revived in her, and she looked at it. The fright she had had when the ticket collector caught her by the arm to return half of the whole ticket she had given up. She had put the ticket in the pocket of her jacket and never thought of it again. Had fate decreed her original mistake of taking a return ticket when she needed only a single one? She was at that moment inclined to think so. The question of its use was decided as soon as she saw it. The ticket would take her back to Cornwall and Thalassa. Thalassa would help and shield her. The gilt hands of a church clock opposite the square pointed to 8:30. She knew that the morning express for Cornwall started shortly after 10, but she did not know what part of London she was in or the direction of Paddington. Animated by a new hope, she left her seat and asked the cabman for directions. The cabman looked at her with a ruminating eye. That eye, with unfathomable perspicacity, seemed to pry into her empty pockets and pierce her penniless state. He did not ask her if she wanted to be driven there, but intimated with a shake of his grey head that Paddington was a goodish walk. Then he gave her directions for finding it, implicit and repeated directions, as though his all-seeing eye had divined that she was a stranger to the ways of London. Cicely thanked him and turned away, repeating his directions so that she should not have to ask anybody else. First to the right, second to the left, along Tottenham Court Road to Oxford Street, up Oxford Street to Edgware Road, down Edgware Road to Pratt Street, so it ran. She followed them carefully and found herself on Paddington Station a quarter of an hour before the departure of the express. She entered a third-class carriage, but sat in a corner street, longing for the train to move on. The minutes dragged slowly, and passengers kept thronging in. All sorts of people seemed to have business in Cornwall at that late season of the year. They came hurrying along in groups, looking for vacant compartments. Cicely kept an eager eye upon the late arrivals, hoping that they would pass by their compartment. By some miraculous chance, she was left undisturbed until almost starting time. Then a group of fat women dashed along the platform with the celerity of fear and crowded ponderously in. The next moment the train began to slip away from the station and was soon rushing into the open country at high speed. Of the details of that journey she knew nothing at all. She sat staring out of the window, her thoughts racing faster than the train. The events of the last few days receded from her mental vision like the flying houses and fields outside the carriage window, fading into some remote distance of her mind. Relief swelled in her heart as the train rushed west and London was left farther and farther behind. Something within her seemed to sing piercing for joy, as though she had been a strange wild bird escaping from captivity to wing away westward to the open spaces by the sea. London had frightened her. Its crowded vastness had suffocated her. Its indifference had appalled her. She had felt so hopelessly alone there, far lonelier than she had ever been in Cornwall or Norfolk. Nature could be brutal, but never indifferent. She could be friendly, sometimes. The sea and the sky had whispered loving greetings to her, but not London. There was nothing but hideous and blank indifference there. She was glad to get away from the endless rows of shops and houses, from the unceasing throngs of indifferent people, back to the lonely moors of Cornwall, to look down from the rocks at the sea and breathe the keen, gusty air. As the journey advanced and the train swept farther west, she became dull, languid, almost inert. Lack of food and the previous night's exposure induced in her a feeling of giddiness which at times had in it something of the nature of delirium. In this state her mind returned persistently to Thalassa and the object of her return to him. She was struggling towards him, up great heights under a nightmare burden. She seemed to see him standing there with his hands outstretched, ready to lift the burden off her shoulders if she could only reach him. Then she was back in the kitchen at Flint House, watching him bending over his lamps, listening to the wicked old song he used to sing. The devil and me went away to sea in the old brig Lisbeth Jane. The train caught up the refrain and thundered it into her tired head. Went away to sea in the old brig Lisbeth Jane. And listening to it, she fell into a dazed slumber. She woke with a start to find that it was getting dusk and the train was running smoothly through South Cornwall. As she looked out of the window, a grey copse of hill seemed to rise out of the sea. It was Mount St. Michael. Then she caught a glimpse of Carn Brea and Purple Moors. The people in the carriage began to collect their light luggage and put on coats and wraps. The next moment, the train came to a standstill at Penzance Station. She clung to the safety of the throng in passing through the barrier, fearing most the Saint Fair wagonette which might be drawn up outside. She was not known in Penzance, but the driver of the wagonette might recognize her. But Mr. Krause, indifferent to shillings, had not yet arrived. Cicely hurried past a group scanning the distant heights with the gaunt outline of the descending cab, like shipwrecked mariners on the lookout for a sail. She reached the moor road by a shortcut through the back part of the town and set out for Flint House in the velvety shadows of the early gloaming. It had been raining, but the rain had ceased. The sun, hidden through a long grey day, shone with dying brilliance in a patch of horizon blue, gilding the wet road and making the wayside puddles glitter like mirrors. A sodden little bird twittered joyfully in the hedge, casting a round black eye at her as she passed. The moors, carpeted with purple, stretched all around her, glistening, wet, beautiful. In the train she had felt hungry and tired, with burning head and cold limbs. As she walked, these feelings wore off and were replaced by a feeling of upliftment which was magical in its change. Her misery and a burden dropped from her. The softness of the moors was beneath the feet, and a sweet wind touched her lips and cheeks with a breath which was a caress. The plaintive distant cry of a gull reached her like a greeting. The solitude of Cornwall surrounded her. When she reached the crossroads, she struck out across the moors. Before her, at no great distance, she could see the swelling mountainous reaches of green water breaking on the rocks in a long white line of foam, and the dark outline of Flint House clinging to the dizzy summit of the black broken cliffs. Her false strength failed her suddenly as she neared her journey's end. The house loomed dimly before her tired vision in the fast gathering darkness. She stumbled with faltering steps round the side of the house to the kitchen door and turned the handle. It was locked. She knocked loudly. As in a vision, she saw the white, furtive face of Mrs. Thalassa peering out at her from the window, and her fluttering hands pressed against the glass as though to thrust her back. Cicely rushed to the window. "Let me in," she cried. "It's I, Cicely." The window opened suddenly, and Mrs. Thalassa stood there looking out at her like a small grey ghost, a ghost with watchful, glittering eyes. Go away," she whispered with a cunning glance. "Quick, they're looking for you. They'll catch you." Cicely's heart went cold within her. "Where is Thalassa?" she faltered. "Send him to me. Tell him I've come back." Her eyes travelled vainly round the gloom of the empty kitchen in search of him. "He's gone away." "Gone? Oh, no, no! Don't say that. Where has he gone?" "I don't know. He went away. He's not coming back." She shook her head angrily, with a wild gleam in her eye. "You go away too, or they'll catch you. The police. They come every night to look for you." She cast another cunning look at the girl and shut down the window. Cicely could see her reaching up and fumbling with the lock. Thalassa gone. Despair clutched her with iron hands and held her fast. She glanced up at the window of her father's study and thought she saw the dead man there, his stern face looking coldly down upon her. She turned away shuddering. Where could she go? She had nowhere to go, and she knew her strength would not carry her much farther. She plunged blindly into the shelter of the great rocks near the house. She found herself wandering among them like a being in a dream. Then complete unconsciousness overtook her and sank her down. When she came to herself again, night had descended and a storm was brewing. She sat up wonderingly and looked around her, indifferent to the rain which had commenced to fall on her uncovered head. Gradually remembrance came back to her. She saw that she was lying on the great slab of basalt which overhung the moon rock. She could hear the beat of the sea far beneath her, but she felt no fear. She was not conscious of her body or limbs, of nothing but a burning brain and wide open eyes which gazed out into the darkness and stillness around her. As she looked, it seemed to her startled imagination that the masses of rocks which littered the edge of the cliff moved closer to each other, starting out of the shadows into monstrous, grotesque life, then circling round her in a strange and dizzy whirl. It was as though the old Cornish giants had come back to life for a corybantic dance with the demerits of their race, dancing to the music of the sea, sucking and gurgling into the caves at the base of the cliffs. With swimming eyes, Cicely watched them careering and pirouetting around her. Faster and faster they went, advancing, retreating, bending clumsily, then wavering, toppling, reeling like giants well drunk. A great stone fell into the sea with a splash, as if launched by a giant foot. As though that signaled the cockcrow of their glee, the dancers stopped in listening attitudes and sank back into rocks once more. Cicely turned her eyes weakly from the slumbering rocks to the hills. The light of the coming moon behind them showed the outline of the granite pillars and stone altars of the Druids, where they had once sought to appease their savage gods like the Israelites of old. Cicely had often meditated by these places of sacrifice, trying to picture the scene. Now, as she looked, it was enacted before her eyes. A red light brooded on one of the hills, growing brighter and brighter. Brutish, shaggy figures came out of the darkness, dragging a youth to the altar. Cicely saw him distinctly. He was naked, with a beautiful face, haggard and white, and was bound with cords. Suddenly he freed himself and dashed down the slope into the darkness. He was pursued and brought back, and the cries of his pursuers mingled with an appalling scream for help, which seemed to float down the mountain sides to where she lay, filling the silent air with echoes. This scene, too, faded away, and the beams of the rising moon, now beginning to show over the hilltops, formed in her mind the mirage of a beautiful day, one of those exquisite days which nature produces at long intervals. Cicely saw a blue sky, sunlight like burnished silver, green fields and clear pools in which everything was reflected, a slumberous perfect day with drowsy cattle knee-deep in grass, bees and floating butterflies, and the shrill notes of happy birds. Once more, the tangled loom of her fevered brain wove a new picture. She was back in a bedroom at Flint House, looking down at the graven face of the moon rock. As she looked, a great hand seemed to come out of the sea and beckon to her. The summons was one she dare not disobey. She left her bed, crept downstairs in the darkness, out of the edge of the cliff, and looked down. The face of the moon rock was watching her intently. She thought it called her name. Ah, What was that cry? She came to her senses, startled, and looked fearfully round her. She was alone on the cliffs above the moon rock, and she could hear the sea hissing at its base. But what else had she heard? Had somebody called her name? It was still very dark. To the south, the light of the lizard stabbed the black sky with a white flaming finger, as if seeking to pierce the darkness of eternity. Nearer, the red light of the wolf rock gleamed, a warning to passing souls flying southward from England to eternal bliss, to fly high above the rock where the spirit dog lay howling in wait. Had the cry come from there? Cicely! Cicely! No, it was not the howl of the wolf dog that she had heard. That was her own name. She crept close to the edge of the cliff and looked down into the sea, down at the moon rock. The old Cornish legend of the drowned love came back to her. Was Charles dead, and calling her to him? She would go to him gladly. She had loved him in life, and if he wanted her in death, she would go to him. She clutched a broken spur of rock on the brink and looked down to where the sea bowed round the black sides of the moon rock. She could see her own pool too, lying peacefully and calm on the encircling arm of the rock. In a delirium, she struggled to her feet and started to climb down the face of the cliff. The end of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of The Moon Rock by Arthur J. Rees. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Moon Rock, Chapter 32. The wind tapped angrily at the windows of Flint House. The rain fell stealthily. The sea made a droning, uneasy sound. The fire which burnt on the kitchen hearth was a poor one, a sullen thing of green boughs and coal which refused to harmonize, but spluttered and fizzed angrily. The coal smouldered blackly, but sometimes cracked with a startling report. When this happened, a crooked bough, sticking up in the middle of the fire like a curved fang, would jump out onto the hearthstone as though frightened by the noise. Thalassa sat on one side of the fire, his wife on the other. Her eyes were rapt and vacant. He sat with frowning brows, deep in thought. Robert Turold's dog crouched in the circle of the glow, with amber eyes fixed on the old man's face as if he were a god, and Thalassa lived up to one of the attributes of divinity by not deigning to give his worshipper a sign. Occasionally the dog lifted a wistful supplicating paw, dropping it again in dejection when it passed unregarded. Presently Thalassa got up and went to a cupboard in the corner. From some hidden receptacle he extracted a coil of ship's tobacco and a wooden pipe shaped into a negro's head, with little beads of ice such as may be bought for a few pence in shops near the London docks. He returned to his seat, filled the pipe, lit it with burning bough, and fell to smoking with lingering whiffs, gazing into the fire with dark, gleaming eyes as motionless as the glinting beads in the negro's carved head. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily away in the silence. The dog, with a brute recognition of the unsatisfactory nature of spiritual aspiration, descended to the care of his own affairs and scratched for fleas which knew no other world than his hindquarters. "Go away! Go away! You mustn't come in here!" The shrill voice of Mrs. Thalassa broke the silence like a cracked bell, shattering her husband's meditations and causing the dog to spring to his feet. Thalassa looked at her angrily. She was making mysterious motions with her hands, as if expostulating with some phantom of her thoughts, muttering and shaking her head rapidly. Her husband stared across in silence for a moment. "By God, she doesn't improve with age," he growled. Then louder, "What is the matter with you? What are you making that noise for?" The question went unheeded. To his astonishment, she sprang to her feet with a kind of grotesque vivacity, and darting over to the window, began gesticulating again with an angry persistency as if to someone outside. Thalassa left his seat and went to the window also. His wife had ceased her gestures and stood still, listening and watching. Thalassa pulled back the blind and looked out. The moor and the rocks were draped in black, and the only sounds which reached him were the disconsolate wail of the wind and the savage break of the sea on the rocks below. He looked at his wife. She had started tossing her hands again at some spectral, invisible thing in the shadowy night. She was quite mad. There could be no doubt of that. He endeavored to lead her back to her seat by the fireside, but she broke away from him with surprising strength, and again her voice rang out, "Go away! Go away! You can't come in! I won't let you in! You are a wicked girl, Miss Cecily, and I won't let you in! You killed your father, and you'd like to kill me, but I'll keep you locked out! Go away!" Her voice rose to a screech. The blood rushed to Thalassa's head as he listened to these words. He understood quite suddenly. This was not a demented raving. Cecily had been there. She had come back to him in a fear, and she had been driven away. He turned to his wife and caught her up in his great arms, shaking her violently as one shakes a child. The sight was terrible and absurd, but there was no one to witness it but the dog, who circled round and round in yelping excitement, as though the scene was enacted for his benefit alone. "Has Miss Cecily been here?" The question thundered out in the empty silence. Mrs. Thalassa crouched like a preposterous, hunched-up doll on the seat where her husband had flung her, looking up at him with stupid eyes, but not speaking. He approached her again. "Speak, woman, speak, or I'll strangle you." She backed away, whimpering with fear. "No, no, Jasper, leave me alone." "Has Miss Cecily been here?" The sight of those long, outstretched hands, by their menace to her life, seemed to restore her reason. "Yes," she mumbled. "When?" "This evening, before dark, when you were out." "And you wouldn't let her in?" "No." "How did you know it was her?" "She knocked at the door and looked out of the window." "Did you see which way she went?" "Over by the cliffs, where she used to go." Thalassa repeated these last words mechanically. Anger possessed him, but apprehension stirred in his heart. Cecily had trusted him, she had come back to him, and she had failed her. That had been at 6 o'clock, and it was now 9. 3 hours, and there had been a storm. Where was she? Had she been out in the storm? He searched in the cupboard for a lantern, lit it, and made for the door, followed by the dog. As he flung open the door, the wind rushed in with such force that it beat him back, and the candle in the lantern flickered and lengthened like a naked flame. He fought his way out furiously, slamming the door behind him. Outside, the rocks crouched in the darkness in nameless shapes. Thalassa prowled among them, struggling desperately with the wind, telling himself that she was safe. Yes, by God, she was safe. Of course, she wouldn't stay on the rock in the storm. She would seek shelter. Where? Asked something in him mockingly. Where would she dare go except to you? He stood still to reflect. She might go to Dr. Ravenshaw's, he said aloud, as though answering an unseen but real questioner. "Fool," came the reply. "You know she would not go to Dr. Ravenshaw's. She would not dare." And fear gripped his heart coldly. He stumbled on again, bruising and cutting his limbs among the rocks. As he went, he kept calling her name, Miss Cecily at first, and then, as his fear grew stronger, "Cecily! Cecily!" The wind wailed back to him, but that was all. He stopped again to reflect. It was useless looking for her in the darkness. He could do nothing until the moon was up. The sky was already beginning to brighten with the coming light. So he stood where he was, waiting. In a quarter of an hour, the moon showed above the horizon, slurred through the rain, like a great drowned face. Higher and higher it rose until the black curtains lifted off the moors, and the light shimmered on little pools left after the rain, made fretwork in the shadows of the rocks, and fell upon the surface of the sea. And as the moon rose, the hideous uproar of wind and sea began to die away. Thalassa threw down the lantern and resumed his search. Carefully he explored in and out among rude masses of rock, beating farther and farther away from the house, cautiously skirting the perpendicular edge of the cliffs, looking over and backing away again. His wider cast brought him at length to where the moon rock rose from the turmoil of the sea. He crept on hands and knees to the bold face of the cliff and looked down. By the light of the moon, something caught his eye far below, something white and small, showing distinctly against the black, glistening base of the moon rock. He could not discern what it was, but a nameless terror seized him, and his jaw dropped as he crouched there, gazing. Then he scrambled to his feet with a wild cry and made for the path down the cliffs to the pool. It was some distance from where he was, but there was no shorter way. He rushed recklessly along the cliff edge till he reached it and climbed down. It was there he found her. She was lying limp and motionless on the edge of the pool, and the receding tide was still lapping over the shelf of the rock which the sea had flung her. Thalassa dropped on his knees beside her. "Cicely, Cicely!" he cried hoarsely. "It's me, Thalassa!" He stooped over her, calling her repeatedly, but she did not reply. Her face showed still and white in the moonlight. He unfastened the front of her dress and put his hard hand on a soft flesh, but he could not feel a heart beating. He lifted her tenderly in his arms, and she lay against his body, inert and cold, her wet head resting on his shoulder. Thus he started the ascent of the cliff. A giant's strength still lurked in his aging frame. It was well for him that it did. He had only his feet to depend upon in that long, slippery ascent, and the wind tugged at him angrily, as if anxious to jerk him off the path into the sea. But he fought his way up with his burden, though his body was swaying and his head was dizzy when he reached the top. He did not stop for a moment. Still holding her fast, he set out, not for Flint House, but to the church town. Dizzy, panting, and staggering, he struggled on across the moors, and as he walked, he listened anxiously for any sound from the inanimate form in his arms. But she lay still and motionless against his breast. On he went until he reached the church town and made his way up the empty street to Dr. Ravenshaw's house. He turned in the garden gate and beat it with his heavy boot against the closed door. The end of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Moon Rock by Arthur J. Rees. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Moon Rock, Chapter 33. Someone stirred within, and a ray of light in the fanlight grew bright as footsteps in the passage drew near. The door opened and showed the figure of Dr. Ravenshaw holding in his hand a lighted lamp which shone upon Thalassa and the dripping figure in his arms. The doctor looked down from the step in silent surprise, then stepped quickly back from the threshold and opened the surgery door, holding the lamp high to guide Thalassa in. "There, on the couch," he said, placing the lamp on the table. "What has happened?" "Miss Cecily fell over the cliffs by the Moon Rock. I found her and carried her up and brought her straight here." The doctor's quick glance was a professional tribute to the strength of a frame capable of performing such a feat. He turned his attention to Cecily, bending over her and feeling for pulse. With a sharp exclamation, he dropped her wrist and tore open the front of her dress, placing his hand on her heart. With this other hand, he took up his stethoscope from the table. "Bring that lamp closer, quick!" he cried. Thalassa lifted the lamp from the table and stood beside him. The yellow glow of the lamp enveloped the livid bluish features of Cecily and the stooping form with the stethoscope. The instrument of silver and rubber held miraculous possibilities of life and death to Thalassa. He watched it anxiously, directed the light upon it. The shape on the couch remained motionless. Thalassa's gaze wandered from the stethoscope to Dr. Ravenshaw. The doctor's bent neck showed white between the top of his shirt and the grey hair above it. He was wearing no collar, so he must have been going to bed when the knock came. Thalassa's eyes dwelt on the exposed flesh with a steady yet wondering contemplation. The lamp in his hand wavered slightly. Dr. Ravenshaw rose to his feet, oblivious of the man who was staring at his neck from behind. His downward glance rested on Cecily's face, and his eyes were grave. He turned away and walked out of the room, but returned almost immediately with a small mirror. "Hold the lamp higher," he said to Thalassa. "I want the light to fall right on her face. Higher still. So." He fell on his knees by the couch and held the mirrored side of the glass to Cecily's lips. The lamp, held aloft, illuminated his face as well as hers. His features were set and rigid. Thalassa stood still, his eyes brooding on the sharp outline of the bent mask. A vague idea, startling and terrible, was magnifying itself in his mind. Once his glance wandered to Ravenshaw's neck, then returned with growing fixity to his face, seen at closer range than he had ever beheld it. In the vivid light, the elemental lines beneath the changes of time took on a strange resemblance to a face he had known in the distant past. A spectral being seemed to rise from the dead and resume life in the kneeling body of Dr. Ravenshaw. Involuntarily he stepped back, and the likeness vanished in the arid distance. The veil of the past was dropped again. He could see nothing now but the commonplace, whiskered face of an elderly Cornish doctor bending over the inanimate form on the couch. Again the lamp shook slightly. "What are you doing with that light?" said Ravenshaw peevishly. "Cannot you hold it steady? Bring it closer, man. Closer than that. Now, hold it there." In the nearer vision, the elemental lines of a forgotten face again confronted Thalassa beneath the flabby contours of age. It was like looking at a familiar outline covered by a transparent mask. He stood stock still with uplifted lamp, like a man in a trance, but his eyes never left Dr. Ravenshaw's face. Some minutes passed silently before Dr. Ravenshaw withdrew the mirror from Cicely's lips. He turned it over and looked closely at the surface of the glass. The man behind him stared over his shoulder. Their eyes met in the mirror and held for a moment fascinated. In that brief space of time, the revelation and recognition were completed. Dr. Ravenshaw's glance was the first to break away. The hard brown eyes watching him followed the direction of his view to a pair of spectacles resting on the table. Thalassa understood the intention and harshly forestalled it. "No use to put on your glasses now," he said. "I recognize you, and I've seen that damn scar on your neck." He put the lamp back on the table, and his hand went towards his belt. Ravenshaw understood the motion and checked it with a gesture. "No need for that either, Thalassa. There are other things to think about." Thalassa's hand dropped to his side. "You're right," he muttered. "Get on with your doctoring." "No, not now," answered Ravenshaw sadly. "It's no use. She's dead." "Dead?" Thalassa stood overwhelmed. Silently he surveyed the slight recumbent form on the couch. His moving lips seemed to be counting the drops which dripped from her clinging garments onto the carpet. "Dead, did you say? Why, I carried her here, brought her across the moors to you." His voice trembled. "Can't you do something?" "No, not now. It's too late." Thalassa's eyes rested attentively on the other's face. Ravenshaw's complete acquiescence in death as an unalterable fact stung his untutored feelings by its calmness. "Dead," he repeated fiercely. "Then you've got that to pay for now, Remington?" "Pay? Oh, yes, I'll pay. Make payment in full," was the reply, delivered with a bitter look. "But not to you." "To think I shouldn't have known you!" Thalassa spoke like a man in a dream. "After all these years? After what I suffered alone on that island? Through you and Turold? You'd hardly have known me if you hadn't met me 6 months afterwards instead of 30 years. Robert Turold didn't know me. Nobody knew me." Thalassa's eyes still dwelt upon him with the unwilling look of a man compelled to gaze upon an evocation of the dead. "Where did you get to that night?" he quavered. "I could have sworn, could have taken Bible oath, that you and that other scoundrel had killed me. I've no doubt. But it so happened that I was saved, miraculously and unfortunately. I fell onto a projecting spur of stone or rock not far down, which caught and held me. By the light of the moon I saw you come along the ridge to look for me. You were almost close enough for me to push you into that infernal sulphur lake where you hoped I had gone. You turned back in time, fortunately for yourself." Thalassa kept his gaze upon him with the meditating intentness of one trying to learn anew a face so greatly altered by the awful changes of the years. His great brown hands, hanging loosely at his sides, clenched and opened rapidly with the quickness of action which had something vaguely menacing in it. "I know your eyes now," he mumbled. "With the glasses on, you're different. That's why you wore them, I suppose. Turold heed you that night you killed on. He knew your footsteps. I thought he did. I laughed at him. I would to God Almighty I'd hearkened to him, and then I might have catched you. How did you get away from the island?" Ravenshaw raised his head to reply, then stood mute in a listening attitude. Outside the window the sound of footsteps crunched the gravel walk and approached the house. Thalassa heard and listened to. The crunching ceased, and there was a knock at the door. Thalassa looked questioningly at Ravenshaw, who nodded in the direction of the door. "Open it," he said. Thalassa hesitated. His eyes sought the couch. "Yes, in here," said Ravenshaw understandingly. "We shall want witnesses." Thalassa went to the door and opened it. A man's voice in the darkness asked for Dr. Ravenshaw, and the owner of the voice stepped quickly inside at Thalassa's invitation. The visitor peered at the tall figure in the unlighted passage. "Is it you, Thalassa?" he said hesitatingly, and Thalassa recognized the voice of Austin Turold. The voice went on. "Tell me." "In there." Thalassa jerked his head towards the gleam falling through the partly open surgery door. "He wants you." He walked ahead and pushed the door open. Austin Turold followed, but started back as he looked within. Then he entered, his eyes dwelling on the shadowy outline on the couch in the corner. "What has happened at Flint House, Ravenshaw?" "Now? Tonight, I mean?" He spoke shakily. "There's a story abroad of Thalassa having been seen carrying a figure through the church town and entering your house. Has somebody fallen off the cliffs? Been drowned? Is that it?" He stepped quickly across to the couch and, looking down, as swiftly recoiled. "What does this mean?" he hoarsely cried. Ravenshaw did not speak. "Miss Cicely fell over the cliffs by the moon rock," said Thalassa. "I went down for her, but it was too late. She was drowned." Austin's look sought Ravenshaw's, who nodded in confirmation. "More horror, more misery," whispered Austin. A shudder ran through him. "I do not understand," he said simply. "Thalassa?" "It's not for me to explain," said Thalassa quickly. "You, then Ravenshaw." Ravenshaw spoke slowly. "They have been looking for the man who killed Robert Turold, your brother. Well, I am he." "You!" gasped Austin in a choking voice. "What do you mean? I do not understand you. My son has been arrested." "He has been arrested wrongly then. It's I alone am responsible." Austin groped for his glasses like a man suddenly enveloped in darkness. His fingers closed on them and adjusted them on the bridge of his nose. Through them he surveyed the man before him with close attention. "Ravenshaw," he said gravely, "either you are mad or I am. Did not my sister call here to see you on the night my brother was killed, and did you not go with her to Flint House and break into my brother's room? How then could you have killed Robert? Besides, I saw my son at Penzance today. He tells me he is innocent, and that the murderer is a man whom Robert and Thalassa robbed and wounded on a lonely island 30 years ago and left there for dead, as they thought. What does it all mean?" "These things can all be explained," replied Ravenshaw. "It's a long story. Sit down, and I'll tell it to you." "Not here," replied Austin unsteadily. His glance went to the corner of the room and the tranquil figure on the couch. He hid his face for a moment in his hands, then said, "Let us go to another room." Ravenshaw made a sad gesture of acquiescence. "Come," he said quietly, lifting the lamp from the table. The other two followed him, and Thalassa closed the surgery door gently behind him. The doctor led them into a sitting room opposite, where they seated themselves. After a moment's silence, Ravenshaw began to speak in low, controlled tones which gave no indication of the state of his feelings. "You know all about this island part of the story," he said inquiringly. "How your brother and Remington, seeking their fortune together, came to be there?" Austin Turold nodded. "I am Remington," pursued the other. "I will take up the story from that point. It will save time." Again Austin Turold assented with a nod. There was neither anger nor resentment in his glance. The look which rested on the speaker was one of unmixed amazement. The end of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of The Moon Rock by Arthur J. Rees. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Moon Rock, Chapter 34. I will pass over as briefly as possible what happened after I was left behind in that horrible place. By the light of the moon I saw them go. From the ridge I saw them put out to sea. I watched them until the boat was a mere speck on the luminous waters and finally vanished from sight. I was left alone, a desperately wounded man, on an arid, sulphurous island without food or water. When I was sure the boat had gone, I returned to our camping place and bound my wounds with strips torn off my shirt. Then I fell asleep. I must have developed fever in my slumber, for I have no clear recollections of the next few days. I vaguely recall roaming like a demented being among those solitudes in search of water and finding a boiling spring. The water, when cooled, was drinkable. I suppose it saved my life. For food, there was shellfish and mutton bird eggs, with no lack of boiling water to cook them. I lived there so long that I forgot the flight of time. I became a wild man, a mere shaggy animal, living, eating, and sleeping like a beast. I was rescued by a passing steamer at last, rescued without any effort of my own, for I had gone past caring. From the ship, they saw me leaping about the naked sides of the volcanic hills like a goat, and they put off a boat. Some lady passengers were badly scared when I was brought aboard, and no wonder. They were very kind to me on that ship. She was homeward bound and brought me to England. I told the captain my story, but I could see that he didn't believe me, so I told nobody else. Not that anybody wanted to know, really. One's misfortunes are never interesting to other people. I had a little money left when I landed in England. Not much, but sufficient to take me to my wife and support me until I found Robert Turold. I had left my wife living with her parents in a London suburb. Robert Turold and I had both been in love with her before we left England. She loved me, but he had some strange kind of influence over her, the dominance of a strong nature over a weak, I think. Or perhaps it was a more primitive feminine instinct. He was always the wrong man, even then ruthless, determined. It was strange that he should have loved such a gentle, timid creature, though that perhaps was not as strange as a man like Robert Turold loving any woman. But love her he did. She had a great capacity for affection. She was one of those women who have to love and be loved. Her guileless face, her appealing eyes seemed to besiege the protection of a masculine shield in a world which has no mercy for the weak. She was born to be guided, to be led. It was my fear of her simple, trustful disposition which led me to urge her to marry me secretly before I left England with Turold. Her parents did not favor me, and they wished their daughter to marry well. There was an aunt from whom she had expectations, and the aunt had a prospective husband in view for her. I feared their joint influence. She consented willingly enough. She was easy to persuade on the eve of a parting. She clung to me, weeping. Her husband. I was to make enough money to return to England to claim her in a year or so. That was a plan. But I had been absent nearly 3 when I was left on the island, and another 12 months passed before I reached England again. 4 years, a long time. Almost any combination of circumstances can be brought about in such a period. People die, marry, or can be forgotten as though they had never existed. It was my lot to be forgotten. I hastened to London, to my wife's home, and learned that the family no longer lived there. Where had they gone to? The maid who opened the door could not tell me. She did not know. At my request, she went for a mistress. The lady of the house came down to me, a tall, slender woman, indifferent, but well-bred enough to be polite. She had taken the house from the Bruntons, she said. It was too large for them after their daughter's marriage. It was dusk, and she could not see my face, but she had heard my startled exclamation. Married? To whom? To a Mr. Turold, a very suitable match. They had been married for some months, and she was expecting a child. How she gathered that last piece of information, I do not know. Perhaps she and Mrs. Brunton exchanged letters. Women write to one another on the slightest pretext. That, though, made me cautious. Fortunately, I had not given my name. I thanked her and rose to go. She offered to write down the Bruntons' address for me. They had gone to live in the country, but I said I could remember it. And I got away from the house in the gathering darkness without her actually seeing my face. Not that it would have mattered much if she had. I thought it all over that night. I visualized readily enough what had happened. Robert Turold, returning to England with some concocted story of my death, had swept her off her feet, caught her on the rebound. He had returned a prosperous man, and doubtless his love-making was reinforced by Alice's worldly parents and the matchmaking old aunt. The combination was a strong one, and I was supposed to be dead. So she married him without breathing a word to anybody of her previous secret marriage to me. I realized that at once. She would be too afraid, left to herself. She would tell herself that it wasn't worthwhile, that nobody need ever know now. I could imagine her twisting her little hands together in apprehension as she faced the problem, our secret, then gradually becoming calmer as something whispered in her ear that it was her secret now and need not be told. You see, I knew her nature so well. There are many such natures. Gentle souls who shrink from responsibility in a world which, sooner or later, gently says to it that we are compelled to shoulder the burden of our own acts. I was not long in making up my mind. I determined to do nothing. I take no special credit to myself for that decision. The marriage with Robert Turold was an accomplished fact, and my belated reappearance upon the scenes would have plunged her in unhappiness. She was about to become a mother, too. That weighed with me. I loved her far too well to injure her or a child. It meant letting Robert Turold go free if I remained dead, but there are other things in life besides money and revenge. Fortunately, the position from the practical point of view was simplified by the death of my only relative, my uncle, during my absence from England, who had bequeathed a small property to me, not much, but sufficient for my own simple needs. I took my uncle's name, the better to conceal my identity, and resumed the medical studies which had been interrupted by my departure from England 4 years before. When I received my degree, I searched for a remote spot where I was not likely to encounter anyone who had known me in my past life, and chose this lonely part of the Cornish coast. And here I have remained for 30 years. They have not been unhappy years. It was not my disposition to waste my life by hugging the illusions of the past. My days were occupied walking long distances to see my patients scattered at distant intervals on this desolate coast, and my nights I spent in antiquarian and archaeological studies, which are always a favorite pursuit of mine. It was a hobby which earned me some local repute in the course of the years, and was ultimately the means of bringing me face to face with Robert Turold again. That was the last thing in the world I desired to happen. In the early years, I used to think of him wedded to my wife, and wondered whether he had succeeded in his great ambition. After a while, the memory faded, as most memories do with the passing of the years. Then the meeting came. 6 months ago. I heard Flint House was let, though not to whom. The news did not interest me. But next evening, when I returned from my rounds, my servant met me at the door with the information that the new tenant of Flint House was in the consulting room waiting to see me. I went in. The tall, elderly figure sitting there rose at my entrance and said, "Not a patient, doctor. Quite another matter." I started slightly at the familiar ring to that harsh, authoritative voice, but I did not know who he was until he handed me his card. He had already commenced talking about that accursed title as he did so, and he did not notice my agitation. He had come to Cornwall in his pursuit of the last pieces of evidence for his family tree, and some local busybody had told him that I was versed in Cornish antiquities and heraldry. That piece of information had brought him to me. He begged for my assistance, my valuable assistance, in elucidating the last scraps of his genealogy from the graves of the past. I could have cut him short by laughing aloud, though not in mirth. I regained my self-command, for I saw that he had not the slightest suspicion of whom he was talking. That in itself was not surprising. I had not recognized him, and how much greater was a change in my own case. Time alters us all in a much less period than 30 years, and there was more than the passage of time. Those months of horrible solitude on that island had changed me into an old man in appearance, with grey hair and bleared and weak eyes from the sulphur fumes. And time had made the disguise impenetrable in the 30 added years. I was an old man. My hair and beard were white, and I wore thick glasses. I felt I need be under no apprehension of Robert Turold recognizing me then or at any time, unless I was careless. His request for my help had a strange fascination for me. There was an uncanny thrill in sitting there within an arm's length of him, meeting his unsuspicious glance, and listening to him with the knowledge that I could have put his plans and ambitions to flight with a single word, and had him begging for mercy. I was in the position of Providence, and withheld my hand, as Providence generally does. My desire to punish Robert Turold had long since died. At 60, revenge is a small thing. What is human retribution to the ferocity of time's revenge on us all? Retribution and justice, these are human catchwords, signifying nothing. What is justice? Who is to judge when the scales are even? It was easier to comply with his request than arouse suspicion by refusal, but that wasn't what weighed with me. I wanted to see more of him, to win his confidence if possible. I was curious to know what kind of life he had given the woman for whose sake I had let him go free for 30 years. He took a liking to me. My knowledge of the ancient Cornish law proved useful in the final stages of his search, his 30-year search for a family tree. It was not long before I discovered that he had found no happiness in life. At times, his face wore a hunted look, the look of a man who walked his days in fear. His imperfect vision peered out on a darkened world with apprehension, though not of me. In my strange position with him, I felt like a ghost permitted to watch, unseen and unsuspected, the trial of a gloomy, solitary mind. It was apparent enough, but only to me. My quickened eyes pierced the outward husk and saw within. I thought I had outlived my desire for revenge, but it grew again at the sight of a punishment which was so much more subtle than anything I could have planned. Death would have put his restless soul to sleep, granted him eternal respite. The sufferings of the spirit were a living torment. His was a strange case. His lifelong pursuit of a single idea, his restricted consciousness of one image, had made him morbid, lonely, introspective. And so the past had revisited him, darkening and disquieting his mind. He feared shadows. He was haunted by footsteps. Footsteps. I learned that when he consulted me for sleeplessness. He told me he used to lie awake at night, imagining he heard footsteps pattering on the rocks outside. I knew well enough whose footsteps he was haunted by. I imagined him lying there in that lonely house, sweating with horror, listening. He asked me once, did I believe in ghosts? I told him no, but I said I had known a case of a man returning to life long after he was supposed to be dead. I related the story, one which had come under my observation as a medical man. He listened with gnawing lip and pale face, and from my window afterwards I saw him striding home across the moors, glancing backwards in the dusk. It was his own fault that he had heard those footsteps in the way he feared. He did not play the game, according to a poor conception of what the game is. If he had done so, he would have been quite safe from me. But there are some things too shocking to be contemplated, even in the worst of a kind. A man does not give away a woman. That is one of the rules. Robert Turold put a woman to shame in a coffin. I had kept out of her way, never going to Flint House because I feared her feminine eyes might be too sharp for me. But she fell ill, and Robert Turold asked me to attend to her. Refusal was impossible, as there was no other doctor nearer than Penzance. She did not recognize me at first, but the shock I received when I saw her left me almost stunned. I had carried her memory through the years, the image of a pretty, slim girl with brown hair and eyes, and a kind of soft vivacity which was her greatest charm. In her place I found lying there a withered, grey woman with dim eyes and broken spirit. God knows what she had gone through at his hands, but it had destroyed her. It was a deathbed. She was worn out in body and spirit, and had no strength to rally. She was weeks dying, but her life was steadily ebbing all the time. It was a kind of slow fever. She was delirious when I first saw her, and delirious or unconscious with few lucid intervals until she died. And the jargon of her wandering mind was in reality the outpouring of a tortured soul. It was a title and the family name, always that, and nothing else. She wasn't well born enough or sufficiently educated to bear the title as his wife. It seemed that the fact had been impressed on her again and again in the long, lean years of the search for the family tree. Let her go away. Go away somewhere quietly with Cicely, and she would never bother him any more. That was the unceasing burden of her cry, a cry to which I was compelled to listen with a torn heart. The reserve, the frame of mind which I wore like armor in Robert Turold's company, I dropped altogether at her bedside. Her lucid intervals were few, but I was not afraid of her recognizing the old Cornish doctor with his muffler, his glasses, his shaggy white hair and beard. The daily sight of her shrunken, aging features reminded me that I had nothing to fear, that time had effectually disguised us from each other's recognition. We were old, we two. Life had receded from us. What had we to do with its fever, its regrets, its passions, and futile joys? The clock had ticked the time away, the fire was dying out, the hearth desolate and cold. I was resigned before, I was resigned then. I did what I could for her, which was little enough. Human progress, such as it is, has been acquired through the spirit. The body defies us. We have no control over it. So she died mercifully unconscious most of the time, and died, as I had hoped, without the least suspicion of the truth. You cannot faintly imagine the shock of Turold's announcement on the day of her burial to me, who had been so arrogantly certain that the secret was safe. If you remember what took place in the Flint House on that occasion, you will recall that it was a question from me which brought the truth to light. Your brother's answer awakened my suspicions and made me determined to find out what he actually knew. He brought out the truth then, as I have no doubt now he intended to do in any case. The puzzle to me was the exact extent of his knowledge. He knew two things for certain. One was that I had married Alice before leaving England, and the other was that I was still alive. But he obviously did not know that I was Remington. How had he found out the two facts? I guessed that the woman he believed to be his wife had revealed the secret of her earlier marriage on her deathbed, but the other was a problem which I could not solve. nor did I try to. When I reached home, I went mad. The calmness, the self-repression of 30 years vanished in an instant in the monstrous infamy of that disclosure. There was something too horribly sinister in the character of a man who could be driven by ambition to make such a disclosure without regret, almost without hesitation. He sacrificed and put to shame two gentle creatures at the beck of his implacable mania. For the title, he had forfeited tenderness, pity, decency, all the human attributes, with a brazen and unashamed face. That man walked the earth alone. By that act, he set himself apart, defying all laws, all feeling, everything. As I grew calmer, I reflected that he could not defy me. I could bring him tumbling from his lofty perch with a few words. He might brazen out his attitude to the whole world, but not to me. What was more, I could dictate to him, could keep his mouth shut with the threat of reviving the past, of putting him on his trial for robbery and attempted murder 30 years before. I determined to do it, to see him and reveal myself, and let him know that my own course of action would be decided by his. If he chose to keep silent, he would have nothing to fear from me. I set out across the moors in the darkness. It was raining, and I walked fast until Flint House loomed out of the blackness before me. Then I paused and considered my course of action. I was about to thwart a madman with a fixed idea in a lonely house where he had in his service another man who could be depended on to make common cause against me when he knew the truth. I was not afraid of Robert Turold, but I was of Thalassa. I knew he was strong enough to hurl me through the window into the sea. These elements in the situation called for caution. I crept across the rocks towards the kitchen window. As I did so, I thought I saw a figure move among the rocks, and I ran quickly to the narrow lip of cliff where overhangs the sea at the back of the house. There I stood for a while, but could hear nothing but the sea raging far down beneath me. I came to the conclusion that I had been mistaken. Who was likely to be prowling round Flint House in a storm except myself? I crept round the side of the house and looked through the kitchen window. Thalassa's wife was in the kitchen, alone, with some playing cards spread out on the table in front of her. But before long the door leading to the passage opened, and Thalassa came in. He sat down, but after the lapse of a few minutes he rose from his chair and approached the window. I shrank back into the shadow of a rock, watching him. He stood looking out into the darkness for perhaps 5 minutes. Then I saw him start, turn his head, and go out of the room. I heard the front door open, followed by the sound of footsteps ascending the stairs. A moment later, I heard the murmur of voices in Robert Turold's room upstairs. I went nearer to try and find out what had happened, but it was no use. I could see a gleam of light in the study window and could hear Robert Turold's voice mingled with feminine tones. Then silence, followed once more by the sound of an opening door. From my place of concealment, I saw two people going down the garden path, Thalassa and a female figure. They passed through the gate and vanished into the darkness of the moors. My opportunity had come. I went to the house and tried the front window. It was unlocked and yielded. I got through and went quickly upstairs. A light was shining underneath the study door. I opened it and saw Robert Turold sitting at his table, writing with his back towards me. At the sight of that atrocious scoundrel sitting there, immersed in his shameful project against a woman I had loved, my self-control gave way utterly, completely. I had intended to be calm, to reason with him, to exact my terms with a cold, logical brain. I did none of these things. Without a word of warning, before he even knew I was in the room, I sprang on him, clutching him, shaking him in a blind, incensed fury till my strength suddenly failed me and left me sick and giddy. "I am Remington," I said. "Jim Remington." I leaned against the table, panting and exhausted, looking at him. His self-control was something to marvel at. He just sat still, returning my look with cold, motionless eyes, no doubt trying to discern the features of the man he had wronged through the film of age. But in spite of his self-control, I could see the grey pallor of fear creeping into his face, and he could not keep his lips from trembling. Twice he essayed to speak, but his mouth refused to utter the words. What he did say was strange to me. When he got it out at last, "I was right." I heard him whisper almost to himself. I knew. He repeated those words several times. It was then I saw that his self-control arose from the fact that although he was terrified, He did not appear to be so greatly surprised. Surprised he was, but not in the way I had expected. His prime difficulty seemed to be to get out of his head in the identity by which he had known me. "You're Ravenshaw, Dr. Ravenshaw," he said. "How can you be Remington?" He brought out this with an effort, like a man trying to shake off an unreasoning horror. I had expected him to face it out, to challenge me, perhaps deny all knowledge of my existence. Instead, he merely sat there staring at me with an air of terrified realization, like a person gazing upon the dreadful materialization of an unexpected phantom. I told him the truth in the fewest possible words, and he listened silently, never removing his eyes from me, the phantom of his past. When I had finished, he lay back in his chair, but his eyes stared up at me with a kind of dead look, like half-closed eyes in a coffin. "I knew that you were rescued from the island," he said, "but I thought you were long since dead." That statement surprised me. I asked him how he had learned of it. He told me it was through the medium of an overheard conversation in a London hotel nearly 30 years before. He had gone up to town to see his lawyer, and one of the people at the hotel where he put up happened to be one of the passengers of the XXXII, the steamer which had rescued me. The man sat at the next table, and Turold heard him tell the story to a friend one night at dinner. It had happened just like that, quite simply, but it was a possibility I had overlooked. Not that it mattered as it happened, but it would have if Alice had been with him. Turold, of course, kept his knowledge to himself. He was too cautious to approach the passenger, but he instructed his lawyer to make guarded inquiries at the shipping office of the vessel in order to verify the story. Then he returned home, consumed by anxiety, no doubt, to wait for my reappearance. As the months slipped past and he did not appear, hope revived within him. It appeared that he had heard the passenger say that I was a wreck, a physical wreck. That must have been a cheering item in a bad piece of news. I can imagine its growing importance in Turold's mind as the time went on and I made no sign. Finally and thankfully, he reached the conclusion that I was indeed dead and that he had nothing more to fear. There was an element of uncertainty about it, though a lack of definite knowledge. I fancy that was one of the reasons which led him to take Thalassa into his service when he turned up some time later. It was a deep and subtle thing to do. Thalassa was bound to help him against me if ever I came back. The years went on, and he grew quite certain, as any man in his position would in the circumstances. He forgot all about me. That frame of mind lasted until he came to Cornwall, and then, it seemed, it came back into his life in the strangest way. I haunted him in the spirit, and he never once guessed that I might be there in the flesh. Who can explain this? As he spoke of it, he looked as though he had a grievance against me, as perhaps he had from his point of view. "You faded from my mind for 20 years, he said, "but here, in Cornwall, your memory began to haunt me. It was your footsteps, principally. I used to fancy you were following me across the moors. Tonight, for the first time, I actually heard them above the noise of the storm. They came to my ears clear and sharp around the house, on the rocks under the window." He cast on me an appalled, a hopeless glance. "Why have you left it so long?" he cried. "What do you want now?" He positively had no glimmering of my feelings. His fixed idea, like a cancerous growth, had sucked all the healthy life out of him. Hot anger stirred within me again, but I retained control of myself this time. I asked him how he had found out about the earlier marriage, and he told me Alice had babbled something in her delirium, enough to arouse his suspicions. It seemed that he had waited for one of her lucid intervals and wormed the truth out of her. "The proofs, of course you have obtained them?" I asked casually. Yes, he had the proofs. He had sent to London for them immediately. I asked him where they were. "What do you want to know for?" he asked in an agitated voice. I told him quite simply that he must give me his proofs and tell the members of his family that he had been mistaken, that Alice's first husband had really died before she married him. If he agreed to that, he had nothing farther to fear from me. I would remain dead forever. "You can destroy proofs, but not facts," he muttered in reply to this. I told him the facts were never likely to come to light if he entered into a compact of silence. He sat for a few moments, as if contemplating the alternatives I had placed before him, sat with one hand in his table drawer, seeking for papers, I thought. He desisted from doing this and said quite suddenly, "The proofs are in the clock case." I had no suspicion. He had once shown me a curious receptacle in the bottom of the clock case where he kept papers. I went towards the clock and was stooping over the drawer in the bottom of the case when I heard a swift footstep behind me. I turned. He was approaching me with a revolver. The secret of his disclosure and the open drawer were explained. I supposed I owed my life to his dim sight, which compelled him to come so near. I sprang at him, and we struggled. That struggle brought down the clock with a shattering crash. Robert Turold and I were locked in one another's arms, wrestling desperately for the revolver, when I saw the great moon face of the clock flit past my vision like the face of a man taking a header off a pier. The crash startled Robert Turold. His hand loosened, and I got the revolver from him. As I tore it from his fingers, it went off and shot him. He backed away from me with a kind of frozen smile, then crumpled up and slid to the floor. I bent over him. He made a slight movement, but I could see that he was dying, that he had only a very few moments to live. Coolly and rapidly, I reflected. The fall of the clock would be heard downstairs. Flight. There was a chance if Thalassa had not returned. My other instinct was to secure the proofs first, though they were really useless then. I rummaged in the clock case and found a large envelope which I stuffed in my pocket. The face stared up at me. The clock had stopped at 9:08. I had an idea, an inspiration. I pulled the long hand down to the hour off to 9:30. If I escaped from the house undiscovered, with only that half-stupid little woman downstairs, I would rush across the Moons' home, call my servant on some pretext as soon as I got in, and asked her the time. Then I should be quite safe. Could defy everybody. Make it 10 o'clock then. No, too long to be safe. It might be discovered. It is strange how quickly the brain works when the instinct of self-preservation is aroused. These thoughts flashed through my mind in a kind of mental lightning. In the briefest possible space of time, I was on my feet and out of the room. I locked the door on the outside, intending to take the key to defer discovery, but it slipped from my fingers in my haste and fell in the dark passage. I dared not stop to search, for just then I heard a sound, or thought I did. Panic seized me. I feared I was trapped, my escape cut off. I flung precaution aside and went leaping downstairs to the door. I fumbled for the door catch in the darkness, flung open the door, and ran out into the night, across the moors, and home. I had hardly got inside before your sister came with her husband to see me, to beg me to go with her to Flint House and reason with her brother. To reason with him. He was beyond the futility of argument, the folly of retort. I did not want to go at first. Then it dawned upon me that a kind fate offered me a providential chance of securing my safety. No suspicion could fall on me if I went back and found the body. And so it turned out. We reached Flint House just at the right moment for me. I broke into the room and found him dead. He was not where I had left him. In a last paroxysm, he had struggled to his feet and fallen across the clock case with the intention, as I shall always believe, of putting back the hand of the clock. I think his dying vision saw me alter it. His last effort was to thwart my intention to mislead those upon whom would devolve the duty of investigating his death. But death was too quick to allow him to carry out his intention. The cessation of the speaker's voice was followed by silence. Thalassa had nothing to say. No need for words. Austin Turold could not trust himself to speak. It was not that the cynical philosophy of life failed him at that moment. The eternal staging of the drama was the eternal tragedy of the performers. But he was thinking of his son. He had vision enough to realize that in Cicely's death, Charles had lost all. His own hardness of outlook melted at that thought. It crumbled his worldliness to ashes, flooded his heart with vain regret, found utterance at last in the whispered words, "How am I to tell my son?" His eyes, dwelling on the door of the inner room, revealed the direction of his thought. The end of chapter 34. The end of the Moon Rock.